Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back to a time where hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority, and honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this. Imagine stepping into the heart of a medieval town, the kind of town that smells like a mixture of old wood, damp straw, and something much less pleasant. The odour of unsanitary streets and the human and animal waste that finds its way into every crack and crevice. It's a little overwhelming, but in this time it's all just a part of daily life. The cobblestone streets beneath your feet are worn down by countless footsteps, donkeys and carts. The buildings around you, tall and narrow, seem to almost lean toward one another, as if they're in a quiet conversation, sharing the secrets of the past. The air is thick with dust, dampness, and the mingling scents of cooking food from nearby stalls. You catch the rich aroma of freshly baked bread, the sharp smell of roasting meat, and something else, a stench of sweat, urine, and stagnant water. You're no stranger to unpleasant smells, but this is next level. You glance around, taking in the scene. Children run barefoot through the streets, their faces streaked with dirt. The clothes they wear are heavy, worn down, and patched up from years of use. You feel a sense of discomfort creep over you as you notice that the people around you don't seem to mind. Some laugh, some yell at each other, while others look lost in their thoughts, but most of them are unbothered by the mess. Perhaps because to them it's normal. It's their reality. They've never known anything else. The town is alive with sound. The blacksmith's hammer rings out as he pounds red-hot iron, shaping tools and weapons. The chatter of merchants fills the air as they try to peddle their goods. The clatter of hooves on the cobblestone streets is constant, accompanied by the occasional shout of a passerby. Over here, a dog chases after a piece of meat, its tail wagging in the midst of a crowd. And just beyond the market square, you spot a group of people gathered around a well, drawing water. But the most striking feature of this town, besides the obvious lack of personal space, is the unmistakable lack of cleanliness. You can't help but notice how dirty the place is, and how comfortable everyone seems in it. The people walk through the muck without hesitation, their shoes, if they even have them, caked in mud. They pass by puddles of water filled with floating debris, animals wandering freely through the streets, and children running around barefoot. It's a world where hygiene, as you know it, doesn't exist. And as you stand there trying to take in the madness of it all, you realise you wouldn't survive this. At least not for long. Modern hygiene, with all its conveniences, would be a luxury you'd have to leave behind. Here, you'd have to adjust. You would have to find comfort in discomfort, or simply learn to ignore it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, comment your location and local time. Where are you and what time is it? It's always fun to see how far this journey reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the next few moments, you'll find yourself learning how hygiene, or the lack thereof, was one of the defining features of medieval life. But don't worry, there's no rush. You have nowhere else to be. You take a few steps further into the town, trying not to breathe in too deeply. The first thing that strikes you as odd, and probably the most notable thing about this place, is that water isn't exactly abundant. Sure, there's a well, but the water there is shared by everyone in the community. It's not exactly pristine. In fact, it's more of a communal gathering point for both humans and animals. Think of it like a really old-fashioned public restroom with water. That's what you're dealing with. As you walk, you can't help but notice the lack of what would be considered basic hygiene by today's standards. Bathing, for example, isn't something people do frequently, and when they do, it's usually in a public bathhouse, which, as you might imagine, isn't the most private place to clean up. These bathhouses are crowded, noisy, and, most importantly, unsanitary. The water they use is reused by everyone, and more often than not, it's teeming with bacteria. But for the people of the medieval world, this is a luxury. Take a deep breath. In the medieval world, the smell of fresh bread and roasting meat competes with the stench of unwashed bodies, livestock and raw sewage. But people carry on. They accept it. They've lived with it all their lives, so it's just part of the atmosphere. A little bit of grime, just a fact of life. That smell is nothing compared to the bigger problems they face, like hunger, disease, or the occasional rogue band of invaders. The further you go into the town, the more you realise how much you've taken modern sanitation for granted. At home, you probably have a shower you use daily, maybe even twice a day, and a toilet you don't think twice about. You wash your hands with soap, rinse off the dirt from your day, and never once think about how lucky you are to have access to clean water. But here, clean water is a rare commodity. Personal hygiene, even in the wealthiest of homes, is a luxury few could afford. Still, you begin to adjust to the rhythm of this place. The constant hustle, the layered smells, and the sounds of daily life. People go about their business without concern for germs or bacteria. The notion of personal space is non-existent. The rich might be better off than the poor, but not by much. It's a world where hygiene is not a priority, but survival is. And in that, they found a strange form of peace. As you continue through the town, you might start to wonder, how did they manage it? How did they survive in such unsanitary conditions? Historians still wonder how people lived without the basic comforts we take for granted today. Some say it's pure human resilience. Others suggest it was the sheer ignorance of disease and germs. Whatever the reason, medieval people lived, and in many ways thrived in their own way, dirty and all. But for now, you're here, witnessing the medieval world in all its smelly, unsanitary glory. And you've got a front row seat to the filth that defined this era. Welcome to the past. Buckle up. You're about to experience hygiene in a way you've never imagined. You've probably heard that medieval people were fond of their baths, but let me assure you, your version of a bath and theirs, well, let's just say they weren't on the same page. The notion of cleanliness in the medieval world was a bit, well, unconventional. You step into a bathhouse now and you're probably greeted with warm water, a plush towel, and a clean, calming atmosphere. In the medieval world? Not quite. The first thing you notice when you enter a bathhouse is how packed it is. The room is steamy, filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the occasional splash of water. The air, thick with moisture, sticks to your skin, and the faint smell of sweat and old soap is unavoidable. At first, you might think this is a place of luxury, a step up from the grimy streets you've just navigated. But as you take a closer look, something becomes clear. This isn't exactly the spa experience you imagined. The water in these public bathhouses is, well, questionable. People come here to cleanse themselves, yes, but the process is far from what we'd call sanitary today. The water is reused, over and over again. The bathhouse's owner doesn't really have a system for filtering it out or keeping it fresh. It's just there. You can't help but notice that the water is really a sickly brown colour, with bits of floating debris here and there. And as for soap, it's not quite what you'd expect either. Medieval soap is more like a hard, greasy bar made from animal fats and ashes, not the foamy, fresh-scented experience you're used to. But despite all this, people still bathe. In fact, the wealthy are known to bathe more frequently, though that doesn't exactly mean they're washing away the germs. These bathhouses serve as gathering places for socialisation as much as they do for cleanliness. You can't help but notice that people seem far more concerned with gossip than with scrubbing off the grime. They'll chat, exchange stories, maybe even flirt a little, all while sitting in the same water that's been shared by dozens of others. You might be wondering why they even bother. The answer is simple: they didn't know any better. In a world where cleanliness wasn't seen as a daily necessity, but more as an occasional luxury, the bathhouse was the closest thing to an oasis of cleanliness. But even so, the water wasn't exactly the thing that made it an essential part of medieval life. The real draw was the social aspect. People would gather here, strip away their clothes, and spend hours soaking in whatever water was available. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about community. And yet there were risks. Disease, for example, was common in these public baths. Historians have long debated whether the bathhouses were hubs for the spread of illnesses. Some even suspect that they contributed to the outbreaks of certain plagues. In a place where people shared water that had been used by hundreds of others, it wouldn't be surprising to catch something unpleasant. But that wasn't something the medieval people were really concerned with. They weren't thinking about germs or bacteria. Concepts like that didn't exist yet. To them, getting clean was a way to relax, to socialise, to unwind after a hard day's work. Imagine sitting in that water, trying to relax, only to realise that you're probably sitting in a puddle of someone else's grime. It's hard to picture, isn't it? Yet for people living in the medieval period, this was just normal. You'd even have to share a sponge with someone else. Oh, and that sponge, it's not what you think. It's actually a cloth soaked in water that you use to scrub yourself off. Once you're done, you pass it to the next person. Hygienic? Not really, but necessary. Absolutely, given the lack of alternatives. So why didn't they just stay dirty? Well, believe it or not, medieval people did understand that hygiene played a role in health, at least to some degree. They may not have had a complete grasp of bacteria or disease transmission, but they did recognise the need for some sort of cleanliness. Even monks, who lived in the most austere conditions, would occasionally take a bath to purify themselves. But with no regular access to clean water, and no understanding of the importance of keeping things sterile, their idea of bathing was simply to rinse off the dirt and go about their day. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't want to spend more than a few minutes in that water, even if you were the cleanest person in the room. Now, it's not all bad. There were people in the medieval world who did care about cleanliness. They'd wash their hands before eating, at least when they could, and some would even keep their personal space a bit more private. But this wasn't a world where daily showers were the norm. Instead, cleanliness was an occasional event, something done when the mood struck or when the circumstances called for it. And with that, the cycle of medieval hygiene continued, day after day, year after year, until slowly the world began to change. Historians still wonder if the bathhouses actually helped to spread disease more than prevent it. Some believe that they acted as breeding grounds for bacteria, and that the lack of hygiene protocols made things worse, but for the people of the medieval world, these places were a vital part of their daily lives. Would they have survived without them? Maybe, but it would have been a much grimier existence. So you leave the bathhouse, feeling a little lighter, but with a newfound appreciation for your modern shower. You take a breath of fresh air and walk through the streets, still trying to shake off the sticky feeling of medieval hygiene. The sounds of the bustling town are still in your ears, but now you're more aware of the sticky, heavy weight of sweat on your skin. As you wander through the town, you can't help but wonder, how did they do it? How did they live in such unsanitary conditions and survive without all the things we take for granted today? It's a question that still puzzles historians and health experts to this day. It's easy to think of a medieval town as a quaint little place full of cosy cottages, busy marketplaces and warm hearths. But when you start thinking about the, shall we say, infrastructure, things take a dark turn, especially when you consider the toilets, or rather the utter lack of them. As you walk through the town, you notice something immediately. There are no modern conveniences. There are no restrooms, no public toilets, no facilities of any kind that we take for granted today. And you begin to realise that the streets you're walking on have a unique smell. It's not just the natural odour of animals and people, it's something worse. It's the scent of waste, human and animal, just left to linger in the open air. Now, let's talk about waste management in the medieval world, or rather, the lack thereof. The first thing you might notice as you wander further into the town is the absence of sewers. That's right, no plumbing, no drains, no pipes to carry away waste. Instead, people did what they had to do and then, well, they left it there. In fact, they didn't really think much about waste disposal at all. The streets themselves often became a dumping ground for, well, everything. You'd find remnants of food scraps, discarded animal remains, and, of course, human excrement, all mixing together in a sludgy mess that you could try to avoid, but probably wouldn't succeed. You find yourself dodging puddles that look suspiciously like urine, and stepping carefully around piles of refuse that have been left to rot in the open. It's not exactly the kind of place where you'd want to stop and take a deep breath. And yet this is exactly how medieval people lived. Toilets? Well, that depends on what you consider a toilet. For most people in the medieval world, a toilet was simply a hole in the ground or a bucket. No fancy plumbing, no flushing, just a hole. Some houses had small privies, little outhouses that were placed at the edge of the property, but many people simply made do with what they had, which meant using the streets as a public restroom or, if you were particularly lucky, a bucket in the corner of your room. If you were wealthy, you might have had a private toilet, but even then it was little more than a chamber pot, a small, usually wooden container tucked away under the bed for nightly use. And once the pot was full, well, it had to be emptied somehow. You'd dump the contents out the window into the street below and hope it didn't land on someone's head. Yes, you read that right. The medieval world didn't care much for privacy, and definitely not for cleanliness. Instead, they did their best to simply avoid thinking about the mess they were creating. The richer folks had it slightly better. Their homes might have had a small private chamber pot or a more elaborate wooden seat with a hole in the middle, but even these were far from the hygienic luxury of a modern toilet. They still had to worry about the same problem everyone else did. The fact that waste had no place to go once it was produced. And where did it go? Well, you've already guessed it. It was left on the streets, often in plain view of everyone. This lack of sanitation, of course, led to all sorts of problems. It didn't take long for the streets to become increasingly unclean and for diseases to spread. The smell was unbearable, and the presence of waste in public spaces created an environment ripe for germs and bacteria to thrive. You can imagine that it wasn't just the streets that got dirty, the people did too, and they didn't have any concept of washing their hands after using the privy. In fact, it was considered somewhat unnecessary to wash at all, as bathing itself was seen as an occasional luxury. Most people simply wiped with whatever they could find, cloth leaves or, if they were lucky, a piece of soft material passed down from someone else. Historians still debate the exact causes of disease outbreaks during the medieval period. While it's clear that poor sanitation played a role, it's also believed that the lack of knowledge about germs made everything much worse. The people didn't know that waste in their water, on their hands, or in the air was causing so much sickness. It's a concept that's incredibly difficult to wrap your head around in the modern world, where the idea of using soap and water is ingrained in us since childhood. But in the medieval world, hygiene was a luxury and disease was just part of life. As you continue walking through the town, you see how the lack of toilets has shaped everyday life. There are no modern conveniences here, no toilets in restaurants, no public restrooms at the market. Everyone simply learns to live with it, or at least try to. You see people holding their noses, walking quickly to avoid the piles of waste scattered across the street. You find yourself stepping more carefully, instinctively avoiding the areas that look the most questionable. And yet the people of this time would have thought little of it. They knew that this was life. Their world wasn't about avoiding unpleasant things, it was about survival. And as they moved through their daily lives, with the stench of waste in the air, they didn't really have a choice but to adapt. You can't help but wonder, how did they live with it? Was it simply a matter of ignorance? Or did they just become used to the discomfort, their noses and minds hardened to the filth around them? The question remains a mystery to many modern scholars. Historians still wonder why medieval people didn't do more to address the waste problem, whether it was a matter of resources, knowledge, or something else entirely. As you leave the town centre and make your way down a quieter street, you begin to feel that familiar discomfort again. The smell of waste still lingers, but now it's not just the streets that feel dirty, it's your mind too. The thought of the lack of proper sanitation in this world, the thought of people living with so little hygiene begins to sink in. It's hard to believe they managed to survive, but they did, of course. They lived and worked, ate and slept, surrounded by filth. They had no choice but to adapt, and that, in a sense, is the heart of medieval hygiene. A world where the idea of cleanliness was as foreign as the idea of indoor plumbing. It was a time where survival mattered more than sanitation, and where everyone had to live with a lot of discomfort. You might think you've seen the worst of medieval hygiene by now, but there's still one more layer to peel back. One that will make you squirm. Lice and fleas. You know, those pesky little critters we now banish with modern medicine, shampoos and fancy gadgets. Well, in the medieval world you didn't have such luxuries. Instead, you had to learn to live with the constant buzz of insects in your hair, the crawling of fleas along your legs, and that ever-present itch that could never quite be scratched away. You can't help but imagine the discomfort of medieval life as you walk through the town, your scalp suddenly feeling itchy. Just imagining it, right? It's no surprise, really. Lice and fleas were a part of life in the medieval world. You'd wake up each morning with the telltale signs of your nocturnal companions, small red bumps, a faint itch that would only intensify as the day wore on, and a constant gnawing discomfort that became your constant companion. In fact, lice were so common that it wasn't even something to be ashamed of. Everyone had them, rich and poor alike. As you look around, you begin to notice how the lack of hygiene played a key role in the spread of these little invaders. The lack of regular bathing, combined with the dense, close-packed communities, created the perfect environment for lice and fleas to thrive. Imagine sleeping in a shared bed or sitting in a crowded room for hours. With no way to properly clean yourself or your clothing, you became a prime target for these pests. And the worst part, lice weren't just a nuisance, they were a health hazard. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as anti-lice treatments or flea shampoos. There was no invention of modern-day remedies to clear your hair of the tiny, blood-sucking creatures. Instead, people resorted to whatever they could find. Sometimes they would use ash or soot, rubbing it into their hair in an attempt to suffocate the lice. Other times they'd turn to herbal remedies, making concoctions with oils or infusions to try to drive the pests away. But despite their efforts, lice and fleas were an ever-present problem. No matter how hard you tried, you simply couldn't get rid of them. In fact, medieval people spent a considerable amount of time trying to deal with lice. They'd use combs, scratching their heads and their arms, trying to rid themselves of their irritating pests. And it wasn't just the poor folk who had to suffer, royals were just as susceptible. Picture yourself walking through the palace with the queen, her elegant gown swishing with every step, her crown shining under the light of the torch. But beneath that crown, lice. Yes, even royalty couldn't escape the tiny invaders. In fact, it was rumoured that some kings and queens spent hours each day having their heads combed by servants to get rid of lice. But even that didn't guarantee a lice-free life. And if lice weren't bad enough, you also had fleas. The little bloodsuckers didn't just infest your hair. They were all over your clothes, your bedding, and pretty much everything else. Fleas loved the medieval world. The cramped living conditions, the shared spaces, the livestock that roamed freely through towns, all of it created the perfect habitat for fleas to thrive. Imagine wearing the same clothes day after day, your woolen tunic sticking to your skin as you sweat, while fleas hopped from your legs to your arms to your neck, biting and causing tiny welts to form wherever they landed. If you were lucky enough to live in the countryside, you could at least avoid the overcrowded conditions of the city. But fleas weren't picky. They would hitch a ride on anyone or anything. Livestock especially were a key source of fleas, and as you moved around town you would come into contact with all kinds of animals. Horses, cows, sheep and pigs. Each of them carried fleas, and each of those fleas would jump from animal to human without hesitation. Living with these pests was simply a part of life. The itchiness, the discomfort, the constant irritation, they were all just accepted as normal. People learned to live with the feeling of tiny insects crawling on their skin. And over time, they developed ways to distract themselves from the constant itching by staying busy, by focusing on work, or by using the occasional herbal remedy. But there was no escaping it. Lice and fleas were the uninvited guests at every medieval gathering. In a way, it's almost comical to think about it from a modern perspective. We have the technology to rid ourselves of these pests in a matter of hours. But for the people of medieval times, lice and fleas weren't just inconveniences. They were a fact of life. You didn't have the luxury of jumping into a clean bed at the end of the day. Instead, you slept, surrounded by your companions, human and insect alike. The best you could do was try to alleviate the itching long enough to get some rest. But even that wasn't always possible. Historians still wonder how people managed to live under such conditions. It's easy to imagine a world where pests were the least of your worries. After all, you had to contend with plagues, hunger, and constant danger from invaders. But perhaps the most surprising thing about medieval life is how resilient people were in the face of it all. They endured, they adapted, and they managed to survive the constant discomfort and illness that came with living in a world without the luxury of modern hygiene. But how did they do it? How did they ignore the ever-present discomfort of fleas and lice and carry on with their lives? It's one of the great mysteries of medieval life. How did they make it through without the comfort of a clean bed, without the tools to keep pests at bay? The answer, perhaps, is that they simply didn't have a choice. They learned to live with discomfort, and in many ways it became a part of their daily lives. You know that fresh feeling you get after you've had a good, long shower? The kind where you feel completely clean, the water running off your skin, washing away the dirt and sweat of the day. Well, toss that thought aside. In the medieval world, that sensation was more of a fantasy than a reality. Imagine walking around in the heat of summer, your skin sticking to your clothes, a thin layer of sweat constantly building up, and the smell of old, unwashed fabric following you wherever you go. Clean clothes? Well, they were a luxury only a select few could enjoy. Now, let's talk about soap, or more accurately, the lack of it. When you think about soap, you probably imagine something soft and lathering, something that bubbles up and smells like lavender or eucalyptus. But for medieval people, soap was not the pampering, indulgent item we know today. In fact, medieval soap was hardly even soap by modern standards. It was rough, hard, and often made from animal fats and ashes. Think of it like the world's worst bar of soap. Greasy, ineffective, and often smelling more like burnt meat than anything remotely fresh. And even if you had this kind of soap, It was a luxury, not something you'd find in every household. But that's just the beginning. Even if you had soap, you couldn't exactly scrub yourself clean whenever you felt like it. Bathing was not a daily ritual, like it is today. People in medieval times didn't think to wash up every day, or even every week, unless it was absolutely necessary. If you lived in a small village, chances are the only time you'd get to wash off the grime of your daily life was at the communal bathhouse. A somewhat questionable experience at best, and as we know, that water wasn't exactly the cleanest. But if you didn't have access to a bathhouse, tough luck. You'd have to make do with whatever you had at hand. Clothes too were a major issue. You're probably used to throwing a load of laundry into the washing machine every week and having fresh clothes ready to go in no time. But in the medieval world, clothes were far from fresh. They were worn until they were falling apart, then patched up again and again. Washing them wasn't even part of the process. Clothes simply didn't get washed. Instead, they got aired out or shaken, and that was as good as it got. Imagine wearing the same woolen tunic for days, weeks, and even months on end, getting dirtier and dirtier as you wore it. The smell? Well, it's safe to say it wasn't a good one. The idea of laundry day didn't exist. Clothes were reused, passed down, and only washed if absolutely necessary, usually by the wealthy who could afford to have their garments cleaned by professional laundresses. The peasants, on the other hand, had to make do. There weren't any soap powders or laundry detergents, no fabric softeners to give your garments a fresh scent. The closest thing you'd get was a rough scrub with some animal fat and maybe some water. But this wasn't enough to remove the oils, sweat and dirt that clung to the fabric. So you'd continue wearing your tunic day in and day out, until it became a part of you, your second skin. You might wonder, why didn't medieval people care about cleanliness more? The answer is a mix of cultural attitudes and practical limitations. People simply didn't have the resources we have today. Soap, water, clean clothes, these were all luxuries, not necessities. People were more concerned with surviving. Washing was something done when it was absolutely necessary, not as a regular part of life. If you didn't have the time or energy to wash, you simply carried on. But the discomfort, the filth, and the smell were all a part of life. And somehow people lived with it. The wealthier folk, of course, had it a little easier. They could afford to hire laundresses or have their clothes cleaned by professionals. But even they had their limits. The king or the noblewoman may have had a slightly more luxurious lifestyle, but they weren't immune to the grime of medieval life. Royalty might have bathed more often than the common folk, but their access to clean, fresh clothes was still limited. In fact, a nobleman's clothing would often be covered in a layer of grease and grime after just a few days of wearing. And even if you could afford the finest silks or velvets, those fabrics were still subject to the same stinking fate as the peasant's wool tunic. The real kicker here, the idea of changing clothes, wasn't as commonplace as you might think. Imagine living in a world where you wear the same thing every day, week after week. You might have a few changes of clothing if you were wealthy, but for the most part, you wore what you had until it fell apart. The idea of fresh, clean and fashionable clothes was just a distant dream. And let's not even get started on the idea of socks. People in the medieval world didn't wear socks like we do today, at least not the way we imagine them. Instead, people would wrap their feet in cloths, leather, or whatever they could find to protect their feet from the dirt and cold. The process of washing these foot coverings? Again, something that didn't really happen. You'd wear your foot coverings until they were worn out, then make do with whatever you had. Historians still debate how medieval people even managed to survive with such poor hygiene, especially when it came to clothing. Did they just ignore the discomfort? Did they somehow find a way to live with the constant grime? The answer, of course, is that they didn't have much of a choice. In the medieval world, the focus wasn't on being clean, it was on surviving. Hygiene, as we know it, wasn't a priority. Comfort was secondary to the bare minimum needed to get through each day. But, let's be honest, you wouldn't want to live this way. You'd want to shower, to wear fresh clothes, to smell like, well, anything but stale wool and animal fat. And yet, here they were, living in a world that offered none of the things we take for granted. Despite the stench, the filth, and the discomfort, they carried on, because they had to. If you thought the idea of not having clean clothes was bad, then brace yourself for the true scent of medieval life, the streets. Picture this. You're walking through the marketplace where all sorts of goods are being sold. The atmosphere is buzzing with life, people shouting their wares, traders calling out, and children running past barefoot as usual. You can hear the jingle of coins, the rustling of clothes, and the clip-clop of hooves as carts rumble by. But as you step forward, the scent hits you like a brick wall, a mixture of sweat, unwashed bodies, decaying food, and of course the ever-present smell of waste. The streets, much like everything else in medieval life, are far from pristine. In fact, they're a chaotic blend of everything that's considered leftover in a city. Food scraps, animal dung, human waste, and anything else that no one knows what to do with. As you walk through the town, you can't help but notice how the roads are filled with refuse. It's not just the food stalls that are messy, it's the very ground beneath your feet. The cobblestone streets are littered with waste, and the worst part? This is just the way it is. Nobody really seems to mind. You look down at your shoes, realising that they're quickly becoming caked in the same mess that everyone else is walking through. Every step seems to drag you deeper into a world of filth, and the worst part is, there's no escaping it. The smell is thick in the air, sticking to your clothes and your hair as you try to walk with any semblance of grace. The fact is, people in the medieval period didn't have paved streets, drainage systems, or anything to stop the natural flow of waste into their marketplaces and roads. The poor sanitation system left everyone to make do with whatever they had. In the marketplace, it's common to see meat hanging out in the open, exposed to the elements. The butcher, with his blood-soaked apron, chops away at slabs of fresh meat as flies buzz around, finding the nearest spot to land and settle. The meat may be fresh by some standards, but by modern hygiene standards, it's already a ticking time bomb of bacteria. You notice that despite the flies and the unsanitary conditions, no one seems bothered by it. The people are used to the smells. They've grown accustomed to the decay, the rotting food, and the stench that fills the air. This is simply their reality, and to them, it's just the way life works. Now, it's not all bad. There are vendors selling fruits and vegetables, and the smell of fresh bread wafts through the air. But that's quickly overtaken by the strong, sour aroma of spoiled produce or the fishmonger's booth, where the smell of fish is so overpowering you can practically taste it. The merchants shout their prices, trying to entice the crowd, but you can't help but focus on the overpowering stench that fills your nostrils with each passing moment. You wonder if anyone has ever actually complained about the smell, or if they've simply accepted it as part of the experience. As you wander deeper into the market, the sound of hooves becomes more noticeable. Horses are everywhere, pulling carts and carrying riders, adding to the general commotion. The horses, like everyone else in this world, aren't exactly known for their cleanliness. Horses, cows and pigs roam freely through the streets, leaving behind piles of manure. The waste doesn't just sit there, it mixes with everything else, adding to the ever-present stench that fills the marketplace. It's not unusual to find a merchant's stall set up right next to a pile of animal waste, and the smell of manure mingles with that of freshly baked bread. The fact that people in the medieval world could live in such conditions and not think twice about it is a testament to just how much the idea of hygiene has changed. The smell of animal waste and decaying food would be enough to send most of us running for the hills, but for the medieval people, this was just their everyday life. They'd walk through the muck without hesitation, their clothes dragging through the filth, and they wouldn't even bat an eye. It was simply how things were. You start to realise that despite the discomfort, there's a certain resilience in how these people go about their lives. They've never known anything else, and they've learned to endure. Historians still wonder how people didn't succumb to more diseases given the overwhelming stench and filth of these marketplaces. But the truth is, people did get sick, and often. The constant exposure to bacteria, waste, and spoiled food led to a number of illnesses, ranging from simple infections to more deadly diseases. But medieval people didn't know that bacteria or viruses were causing their ailments. They had no concept of germs, so they didn't take precautions like we would today. The lack of sanitation was simply the backdrop to their everyday lives, and they dealt with it as best they could. And yet they still found ways to thrive. They worked, they traded, they lived their lives in the midst of this chaos, somehow managing to survive. Sure, they had their share of challenges, diseases, wars, famine, but the market remained a central hub of their world. It's hard to imagine living like this, surrounded by filth and decay, but for the people of the medieval world it was just another day. The more you think about it, the more you start to understand how deeply ingrained this lack of sanitation was in their daily existence. It wasn't just the marketplace, it was the very air they breathed, the streets they walked, the homes they lived in. Everything was touched by the dirt and the filth, and yet they carried on. No one seemed to question it, and no one really thought to complain. This was their world, and they made do with what they had. As you move through the market, you notice something else, a strange sense of community. Even in the midst of all this chaos and unpleasantness, people come together. They chat with each other, laugh, haggle over prices, and go about their business. The marketplace is bustling, full of life, and in a way the stench of waste and decay adds to the vibrancy of it all. You can't help but wonder if there's a lesson in all of this. Despite the discomfort, the dirt, and the unsanitary conditions, the people still find joy in their lives. They still find ways to connect, to survive, and to keep moving forward. Historians may still debate whether this lack of sanitation played a role in the spread of diseases, but one thing is certain. The medieval world was a place where cleanliness was not a priority. People lived, worked, and thrived in the middle of chaos, and they made do with what they had. The filth was simply a part of the fabric of life, and they carried on day after day, never knowing any different. Now, if you thought the lack of sanitation in the streets was bad, you're really in for a treat when it comes to medieval medicine. Picture this. You're standing in a crowded medieval town filled with the clatter of tools, the murmur of voices, and the distinct smell of blood, herbs, and maybe something a little more pungent. There's no sterile environment, no gloves, no modern instruments. The idea of cleanliness in medicine? Well, let's just say it was a far cry from the precision and sterility we take for granted today. As you step into a local apothecary or doctor's office, the first thing that hits you is the lack of any sort of hygiene protocol. You might expect a clean white table with neatly arranged instruments. Instead, you find a cluttered space filled with jars of strange concoctions, dried herbs hanging from the walls, and wooden tables that look like they've seen their fair share of blood. There are no gleaming scalpels or shiny medical tools. Instead, there's a mixture of old knives, blunt forceps, and maybe a few bone saws, all of which have seen countless patients. The tools may not have been sanitized between uses, and the concept of germs or contamination wasn't even on the radar. You approach the medical area with a sense of dread. This is where you would go if you were sick, if you had a wound that needed attention, or, heaven forbid, if you were in need of a surgery. But what would happen to you here? Would you be treated with care and precision? Hardly. In fact, your chances of leaving with the same condition you came in with, or worse, are pretty high. Take a look at the doctor in charge. He's likely an unkempt man in his 40s, with a few loose strands of hair falling from under his cap. He's wearing a stained robe, and you notice a few bloody handprints on his sleeve, likely from his last patient. The physician, a term used loosely, might not even be a trained professional. Most medieval doctors were. Self-taught, learning their trade from old books, local folklore, or even through apprenticeships with other doctors. If you had money or status, you might be lucky enough to get some advice from someone with more experience, but there's no guarantee that the medical knowledge they had would be useful, let alone safe. If you had a fever or a serious injury, the doctor might recommend a mixture of herbs and spices to cleanse your body. These remedies, while somewhat effective in their own right, were far from the scientifically backed treatments we know today. Medieval treatments were based on balancing the humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, rather than the bacteria or viruses that actually cause disease. A doctor might ask you to drink a concoction of boiled herbs, or leeches might be applied to purge bad blood. You'd be lucky if the treatment didn't make things worse. Perhaps the most alarming thing in the medieval medical world, though, is surgery. The idea of a clean operation simply didn't exist. If you broke a bone, were badly injured, or needed surgery for any reason, the doctor would have to get to work immediately, and probably without anaesthesia. You might be given a little bit of alcohol or a quick slap to the head, but beyond that you're on your own. In some cases, you might not even get the courtesy of a numbing agent, just the brutal force of a bone saw or a sharp knife, cutting through flesh in an attempt to save your life. And the idea of sterilising the instruments before use? Not even a thought. You might get lucky and have the tools wiped with a cloth, but it's just as likely that the tools have been used on other patients in various states of illness. At the time, they didn't understand infection the way we do. In fact, most medieval doctors probably didn't even think about the possibility that a wound could become infected. Instead, they operated under the idea that if you bled enough, your bad humours would be expelled from your body. It didn't matter that the same bacteria and germs that caused infection were already in the air and on the tools. This lack of understanding about cleanliness in medicine led to countless unnecessary deaths. You could be treated for an illness or injury only to later die from an infection brought on by unclean conditions or poorly sanitized instruments. And the doctors? Well, they weren't any better off than their patients. Without the knowledge of hygiene, these so-called medical professionals were just as prone to contracting diseases as anyone else. They often didn't wash their hands or change their clothes between treating patients. And as for personal cleanliness, that was optional. Many doctors of the time were just as filthy as the people they treated. Historians often wonder how medieval people were able to survive this lack of proper medical care. The answer, as usual, lies in their resilience, despite the barbaric treatments. And the filth surrounding their healthcare system, medieval people were resourceful. They learned to live with the lack of hygiene in medicine, adjusting to the grim reality of the time. Perhaps the greatest irony of medieval medicine was that it existed in an environment where even the most basic concepts of cleanliness and infection were overlooked. And yet, people still survived. The real question, though, is how many didn't. As you make your way through the apothecary or local doctor's office, you realise how lucky we are to have access to the medical care we do today. The idea of a clean hospital, sterile instruments, and well-trained professionals is a far cry from what medieval people had to deal with. But still, the resilience of the people who lived through these conditions is awe-inspiring. Despite the lack of medical knowledge, they found ways to survive, often relying on their own ingenuity and the little bit of understanding they had of the human body. So the next time you visit your doctor and feel frustrated with the wait, just remember, in the medieval world you'd be lucky to even make it to the doctor in one piece. And while modern medicine is far from perfect, it's a huge step up from what those in the medieval period had to endure. As you wander through the medieval town, you start to realise something curious. How hygiene was as much about social status as it was about cleanliness. The wealthy lived in a different world altogether, one where at least their filth was hidden under layers of expensive fabrics, perfumes, and the occasional visit to the bathhouse. Meanwhile, the common folk, well, they just had to live with it. They didn't have access to fresh water, clean clothes, or even the luxury of private bathing spaces. But the wealthier you were, the more likely you were to escape the worst of it, even if the standard of cleanliness wasn't much better than the peasants. You stop in front of a grand house. Well, it's grand by medieval standards. It's made of stone with tall, narrow windows, and a roof made of thatch and clay. It's a far cry from the cramped, dark cottages you've seen, and it stands proudly in the middle of the town. As you observe it, you begin to understand that hygiene in the medieval world was as much about social status as it was about practicality. The wealthy, while not exactly living in sanitary conditions by modern standards, had access to cleaner clothes, better food, and, most importantly, the ability to afford the occasional bath. The wealthy of the medieval world were the ones most likely to visit bathhouses. They would bathe in private rooms, away from the crowded public baths where everyone shared the same water. You'd probably be led to a stone tub, filled with water drawn from a nearby well, and have a servant or bath attendant scrub you down. For the noble class, this was about both cleanliness and maintaining their status. You didn't just bathe for the sake of cleanliness, you bathed to show that you had the means to afford such luxury. You might also be attended to by skilled attendants, who would massage oils into your skin or even use perfumes to mask any smells. But here's where it gets interesting. The wealthy still had their own hygiene problems. While they had access to better hygiene practices, they weren't immune to the filth that plagued everyone else. The rich may have had cleaner clothes, but they weren't exactly immune to lice, fleas, or other pests. In fact, the lavish fabrics of noble clothing were often perfect breeding grounds for these critters. Royalty might wear silk and velvet, but even the finest garments could harbour pests. You'd imagine that a king or queen's royal robes would be spotless, but in reality these garments were often heavy and thick, making it easy for fleas and lice to make their homes in the fabric. And when it came to personal cleanliness, even the wealthiest weren't above the occasional stench. Imagine for a moment that you're a noblewoman in a grand palace, wearing a beautiful embroidered gown, but underneath that gown, your skin is sticky with sweat and your hair is matted from days without a proper wash. Sure, you may have had access to fresh water and private bathhouses, but you were still living in a world where soap was a luxury, not a staple. And with the use of perfumes or scented oils, you'd mask the scent of unwashed bodies, but it didn't mean you were truly clean. You simply smelled better. This contrast between the wealthier class and the peasants is a fascinating part of medieval life. While the nobility may have been able to afford better clothing and the occasional bath, their hygiene wasn't that much better than the common folks. It's not as if they lived in some pristine, sterile world, far from it. It was a world where personal hygiene was still secondary to survival. The nobles simply had more means to disguise it. But what about the peasants? How did they manage with even fewer resources and far less access to the luxuries enjoyed by the wealthy? Well, their hygiene, of course, was far more basic. They couldn't afford the high-end soaps, oils and perfumes. In fact, they probably didn't use soap at all. Instead, they relied on water, herbal remedies, and what little they could scrounge together. Their clothes, as you've seen, were rarely washed. If a nobleman's tunic got dirty, it was probably sent to a laundress, but for the peasants it was worn until it fell apart. And yet the peasants, much like the nobles, found ways to survive. Despite the constant discomfort of filth and sweat, they continued with their lives. The difference, though, was in the way they lived it. For the peasant, hygiene was a distant second to the immediate needs of survival: food, shelter and protection. For the noble, hygiene was an occasional luxury, a way to maintain their appearance and social standing. But regardless of class, everyone was still living in a world without the luxury of modern hygiene. Whether you were rich or poor, you simply had to make do. As you walk through the marketplace again, you start to notice how people treat each other, based on their status. The wealthier folks walk through the crowd with an air of superiority, their noses held high, pretending they don't notice the dirt underfoot. The poorer folk, on the other hand, move quickly, heads down, trying to avoid standing too close to the smell. But everyone, regardless of their status, carries the same filth in the air around them. They all live in a world where hygiene takes a back seat to the necessities of life. And despite all the differences in wealth and status, it's clear that everyone, noble or peasant, was living in a shared experience of discomfort, all united by the same world of dirt, sweat and disease. In the medieval world, hygiene wasn't about being clean in the way we understand it. It was about surviving in an environment that didn't prioritise cleanliness, where the poor were just as affected by filth as the wealthy, but the difference lay in how they handled it. The wealthy could afford to disguise it, while the poor simply had no choice but to live with it. And as you walk through the streets of this medieval town, you begin to appreciate just how much your own modern comforts, your shower, your clean clothes, really mean. Historians still debate how the class system influenced hygiene standards. Did the rich really live in cleaner environments, or was it all just an illusion, masked by expensive clothing and the occasional bath? It's hard to say for certain, but one thing's clear. As you wander deeper into the medieval town, you can hear the faint sounds of merrymaking coming from a tavern up ahead. The raucous laughter, the clinking of mugs, and the distant thrum of music greet your ears. You're tempted to take a peek. After all, medieval taverns were places of entertainment, relaxation and socialisation, a stark contrast to the otherwise grim surroundings. But before you step inside, something stops you. A smell wafts from the door, so thick and pungent that it almost seems to reach out and grab you. You wrinkle your nose in reflex. It's a mix of sweat, beer, spilled wine, and something far more unsavoury. Medieval pubs were the heartbeat of social life in towns and villages. It's where people came to drink, gossip, and exchange news after a long, hard day's work. But for all their charm and warmth, these drinking establishments were also among the most unhygienic places of the time. They were cramped, poorly ventilated, and far from the cosy little pubs we imagine today. The air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the rank odour of livestock, as many pubs allowed animals to roam freely, especially in rural areas. You step inside and it feels like an assault on your senses. The walls are covered in grime, the floor sticky with spilled drinks and mud from patrons' boots. You can barely see through the haze of smoke from the hearth and the lanterns. The long tables, where patrons sit, are worn from years of use, scratched and chipped from centuries of drunken elbows and heated debates. The tavern is packed, as it always is. The noise is almost deafening, people laughing, shouting and arguing. There's no such thing as personal space here. Everyone is packed together, shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same thick, smoky air. You can't help but notice that there's no real effort to clean up. The wooden floor beneath your feet is sticky with spilled wine and beer, and you can see the remains of meat bones and breadcrumbs scattered across the table. The scent of sweat is overpowering, clinging to your clothes, your hair. And as you make your way through the crowd, you notice the people. Some of them are sweating, some of them are drunk, and all of them seem oblivious to the lack of personal hygiene. But that's the thing about medieval pubs. They weren't about cleanliness. They were about survival, socialising, and numbing the weariness of life with a good drink. The medieval pub was also where diseases spread like wildfire. It was a perfect storm of bad hygiene, people packed together in close quarters, sharing mugs, cups, and eating utensils without a second thought. Most of the drinking vessels weren't cleaned properly. Imagine drinking from a mug that's been passed around dozens of people in one night. The same mug that's been used to drink watered-down ale, probably containing bits of food and grimy fingers. And let's not forget that the pub was often the location for an impromptu gathering of labourers, farmers, and anyone else in need of a break from their dreary existence. After all, you didn't need to be rich to drown your sorrows in a tankard of ale. But the worst part, the tavern was also the ideal place for disease to spread. Medieval people didn't understand germs. They didn't know that sharing mugs and drinking from the same vessels could pass on illness. The constant flow of patrons, each of them carrying who knows what germs, meant that illnesses spread easily. Coughs, colds, and other diseases were a frequent visitor to the tavern, and many medieval towns became breeding grounds for plagues and infections that could wipe out entire communities in a matter of weeks. This is how illnesses like tuberculosis and typhoid fever made their way through these close-knit, dirty spaces. The health risks were made even worse by the fact that sanitation was virtually non-existent. Public toilets were either rare or downright unpleasant, and the idea of hand-washing before eating or drinking hadn't been invented yet. So what did this mean for the people of medieval times? Well, when they weren't getting sick from the tavern's lack of cleanliness, they were likely suffering from the terrible food or drink they consumed. The beer, for instance, was often brewed in the most unsanitary conditions. While it may have been a common drink because of the lack of clean water, it wasn't exactly a health-conscious choice. The ale was often stale, flat, and brewed using whatever grains were available, so you could imagine the microbial party happening in each sip. And it didn't stop there. The bread people ate was often moulded, the meat poorly stored, and the fish, when available, was just as questionable. But despite all of this, the pub remained a cornerstone of social life. People came here to forget about the stench, the dirt, the lice, and the fleas. They came here to relax, to get drunk, and to let off some steam. After a long, tiring day of hard labour, the pub was a welcome escape. There was something comforting about the chaos, the shared misery of it all. You could sit next to someone, have a drink, and hear about their struggles and triumphs, all while trying not to gag from the smell. Still, there were some small comforts in the madness. The pub was also the place where deals were made, relationships were forged, and rumours spread like wildfire. For the people of the medieval world, the tavern wasn't just about the drinks. It was about the camaraderie. It was a place where you could forget about your daily troubles and lose yourself in the moment. Even if that moment was surrounded by dirt, disease, and the constant stench of humanity. Historians still debate how many diseases could have been prevented if people had understood the importance of hygiene in these settings. What if people had washed their hands or used clean mugs? What if the food was stored properly? Could some of the worst plagues have been avoided? These are questions that remain unanswered. But one thing's for sure, the medieval pub was both a sanctuary and a breeding ground. A place for comfort, but also a place for sickness. In the end, it's another example of how medieval life was lived in spite of, and often because of, the filth that surrounded it. As you step out of the tavern, the cold night air hits your face like a refreshing breeze. You breathe it in deeply, glad to be away from the chaos and the stench of the pub. The town is still alive, but you can't help but feel a sense of relief at the thought of escaping back to the comfort of a clean bed and a warm modern home. As you continue walking through the medieval town, you notice a sombre gathering in the town square. The crowd is thick, and the air is tense with anticipation. A public execution is about to take place, a spectacle that has drawn people from all around the area. This is not an uncommon occurrence. Public executions were, in fact, a regular part of life in medieval towns. People would gather to witness the punishment of criminals, not just for justice, but for entertainment. The whole process is oddly hypnotic, drawing people in with the promise of violence and spectacle. But as you get closer, something catches your attention. The conditions surrounding this event are far from clean. You can already smell the mingling scents of sweat, body odour, and the faint stench of decay as the crowd presses closer. The ground beneath you is hard and uneven, covered with a thin layer of dirt and muck that has been trodden down by countless boots. In the centre of it all, you see the executioner, a tall man with a grim expression, standing beside the condemned. The atmosphere is thick with tension, but it's not just the anticipation of the execution that makes you feel uneasy, it's the surroundings. The medieval world didn't have the concept of clean, sanitised public spaces that we take for granted today. The execution site is littered with refuse. The ground is a patchwork of dirt and waste, and the air itself feels heavy, as if it too is steeped in the filth of the time. There's no such thing as a sterile environment here. The crowds are packed together so tightly that you can barely breathe without inhaling the scent of sweat and unwashed bodies. The townspeople have come to watch the punishment unfold, but many of them likely don't care about hygiene or cleanliness. They're simply here for the spectacle, and cleanliness takes a back seat to the drama of the moment. But here's the twist. The execution itself, much like other events in the medieval world, is an event that revolves not only around punishment, but also around public health, specifically the very hygiene, or lack thereof, that surrounds it. Public executions often took place in areas where disease spread easily. The crowd, jammed together with little regard for personal space, would leave behind a mass of waste and refuse, and the area would quickly become filthy with the remains of the day's events. This was a world where hygiene didn't even come close to the minds of the people involved. The smell of blood, sweat, and rotting flesh filled the air, and as the executioner began his grim task, you could feel a wave of discomfort pass over the crowd. It wasn't just the violence that made the scene so disturbing, it was the lack of basic hygiene. Even worse, the process itself wasn't exactly clean. The executioner's tools, often crude and unkempt, were used repeatedly, and there was little effort made to sanitize them between uses. You watch as the man's axe is raised high, ready to bring down swift judgment on the condemned. But before the swing, you notice the dark stains on the blade. Blood from previous executions has dried into the metal, and you can't help but feel a shiver run down your spine as you realise just how unsanitary the whole process is. This isn't just an act of justice, it's an act of unsanitary, gruesome violence, carried out in full view of the town with no concern for cleanliness, no regard for the consequences of spreading disease. Once the execution is complete, the body of the condemned is often left on display for a time, furthering the public spectacle. In many cases, this was a warning to others, a display of power, a reminder that crime would not be tolerated. But what it also was, perhaps unknowingly, was a public health hazard. The body left to rot in the open air becomes a breeding ground for bacteria, and the crowds that gathered around it are exposed to whatever germs and diseases might have been present. But in medieval times, the idea of germ theory hadn't even been conceived. No one thought twice about the consequences of such unsanitary practices. You begin to realise how deeply ingrained this lack of cleanliness was in medieval life. The people didn't know any better. They didn't have the scientific understanding that we have today. Diseases spread because of these practices, because of the lack of hygiene that was so commonplace. And the public execution, grim as it is, was just one example of how hygiene, both in public spaces and in daily life, was neglected. As the crowd disperses, you're left standing there, trying to shake off the unease that lingers in the air. You can still smell the faint traces of the public spectacle, mixed with the stench of sweat, waste, and blood. And while the execution may be over, the impact of it remains. The lack of hygiene is not just a matter of inconvenience or discomfort, it's a matter of public health, of disease, of life and death. It's a reminder that in the medieval world, survival wasn't just about food or shelter, it was also about enduring the filth, the diseases, and the grime that surrounded everyone, every day. As you walk away from the scene, the reality of medieval life settles over you once again. It wasn't just about how people lived, it was about how they survived in a world where hygiene was an afterthought, something to be worried about only if the situation became dire. In this world, death was everywhere, but so was disease and so was filth. Yet somehow the people persevered. They lived, they loved, they worked, and they did it all surrounded by a cloud of grime and illness. Their resilience is almost unfathomable, but it's a testament to how humans can adapt to the most unsanitary, uncomfortable conditions and still keep going. Historians still wonder whether these brutal executions, performed with such a lack of cleanliness and care, contributed to the spread of disease during medieval times. Could the townspeople have avoided the outbreaks that followed? It's a question that may never be answered, But one thing is clear. The medieval world was a place where hygiene was secondary, and survival, both physical and social, was the ultimate goal. You might think that royalty, with all their wealth and power, would have access to the finest hygiene practices. After all, they have the best of everything, don't they? But in the medieval world, even royalty was not immune to the filth that permeated daily life. The idea that the king or queen could live in a pristine, hygienic bubble is, well, a myth, one that couldn't be further from the truth. As you stand before the grand castle, the scent of damp stone, animal waste, and cold air clings to the place. The courtyard is well kept, but even here you can't escape the smell of history, the smell of a time when cleanliness was not a priority. Inside the royal chambers, things aren't much better. Imagine the opulence, the finest tapestries hanging on the walls, golden candelabras lining the rooms, and extravagant furniture made of polished wood. Yet despite the grandeur, there's a pervasive sense of grime. The king, with his regal attire and elaborate crown, might appear clean and well-groomed from the outside, but as you take a closer look, you begin to notice the reality. Beneath that rich velvet robe and intricately designed crown, the king has probably not bathed in days, weeks, or even longer. Medieval royalty had a limited understanding of hygiene, and bathing, though occasionally practiced, was far from a regular habit. You'd think that someone with the means to hire the best servants and access the best bathhouses would be able to maintain a sense of cleanliness. But no, royal hygiene was, in many cases, just as bad as that of the peasants. While the rich might have had access to better living conditions and occasional baths, there were still many barriers to personal cleanliness. The royal bathhouse was often a communal space, shared with other nobles and their attendants. The water would be reused multiple times, and much like the public bathhouses, it wasn't exactly a sanitary environment. There was little to no understanding of the importance of sanitation, and even if the royals had the best servants to prepare the bath, the water was often murky and shared among many people. As you walk through the royal chambers, you notice the faint scent of perfume, no doubt carefully applied to mask the smell of unwashed bodies, but even perfume couldn't completely cover the stench that hung in the air. You wonder if the royals even noticed it, or if they had simply grown accustomed to the odour. After all, it was a world where the concept of clean was much more fluid than it is today. Royalty was concerned with maintaining appearances, not with personal hygiene. Their focus was on their power, wealth, and image. Looking clean was secondary at best. In the royal courts, where there was an ever-present need to maintain a sense of grandeur, hygiene became something of an afterthought. The king's attire might be impressive, but underneath the layers of silk and velvet, he might be just as filthy as any peasant. The royal wardrobe was carefully crafted, but even the finest clothes could not escape the grime that naturally accumulated over time. The same garments would be worn for weeks, if not months, without any real cleaning. You can't help but wonder what went on behind closed doors. Surely in private, royalty must have known the truth. But in public, it was all about maintaining appearances, pretending that everything was pristine, even if it was far from it. Now, let's talk about the royal servants. The cleaning staff, the attendants, the people responsible for maintaining the royal court. What was their role in all this? While they were certainly tasked with caring for the royal household, their own hygiene was likely not much better than the people they served. Servants were often forced to live in the same squalid conditions as the common folk, and while they may have had access to a few basic comforts, their lives were still far from clean. They might have had more access to water, but that didn't mean they could bathe regularly or keep their clothes fresh. The sheer amount of work and lack of resources made it nearly impossible for them to maintain cleanliness in a meaningful way. In fact, servants were often seen as expendable. The nobles' attitude toward personal hygiene extended to their treatment of servants. They were not given the same care or attention when it came to cleanliness. Even in royal households, the notion of cleanliness didn't stretch beyond the wealthier members of the court. For the rest, it was a matter of survival, getting through each day without succumbing to disease, dirt, or discomfort. As for the royal court itself, it was more about spectacle than cleanliness. The idea of a clean king or queen was little more than a myth, a carefully curated image that masked the reality of medieval life. Historians still debate the exact hygiene practices of royal families during the medieval period. Some suggest that kings and queens may have bathed more frequently than their subjects, but the quality of the baths and the water they used was still far from ideal. Others argue that the royal court had just as little regard for hygiene as the peasants. While wealth and status may have given the royals access to better clothing and the occasional bath, it didn't grant them immunity from the filth and diseases that plagued the rest of society. Even their private spaces, despite being luxurious by medieval standards, were not immune to the same hygiene issues that affected the common folk. In the end, the royal myth of cleanliness was just that, a myth. So as you walk away from the Grand Palace, you can't help but feel a strange sense of comfort. The idea of royalty, of clean, majestic kings and queens, was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of their daily lives. No one, no matter how wealthy, could escape the lack of hygiene that defined medieval life. The rich, like everyone else, had to live with the grime, the filth and the discomfort of a world that was, at best, only occasionally clean. You've made your way to the darker corners of medieval history, and now you're about to confront one of its most catastrophic and grim chapters, the Black Plague. The Black Death, as it was called, swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing an estimated 25 million people in just a few years. But before you jump into the dark details of the disease itself, it's important to understand the context in which it thrived, a world that had no concept of sanitation, hygiene, or how diseases spread. As you walk through the streets of a medieval town, you can feel the weight of the past pressing down on you. The air is heavy with the knowledge that this very same place could have been a hotbed for disease. The streets, with their filth and waste, were the perfect breeding ground for the bacteria that would eventually cause one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. You look around, and the very conditions you see, people living in close quarters, human and animal waste mixing in the streets, a lack of clean water, make it clear that survival was more about luck than anything else. The Black Plague, as you may know, was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was spread through fleas that lived on rats. In a world where hygiene was practically non-existent, the conditions were ripe for a perfect storm. Rats, with their fleas, found their way into homes, marketplaces, and homes of nobility. The fleas would bite humans, transmitting the bacteria that caused the plague. The disease spread quickly, infecting thousands in just a short period. But the spread of the disease wasn't just a result of the rats and fleas. It was also due to the fact that medieval people had no understanding of hygiene or how diseases were transmitted. With no clean water or sanitation, it was easy for the bacteria to spread through contaminated water, food and air. You can't help but imagine the absolute horror of living in a world where such a plague was spreading with such speed and ferocity. And the worst part? People had no idea what was causing the illness. As you continue your walk through the town, you begin to see how the Black Plague wreaked havoc on the population. Entire families were wiped out in a matter of days. It wasn't uncommon for people to fall ill in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The symptoms were gruesome. Swollen, painful buboes, the telltale sign of the plague, fever, chills and delirium. For many, the disease moved so quickly that there was no time to react. The bodies piled up in the streets, and the air grew thick with the scent of death. The few medical professionals who existed at the time had no idea how to treat the disease. They relied on bloodletting, leeching and prayers to cure the plague, none of which were effective. In fact, historians have speculated that one of the main reasons the Black Plague spread so rapidly was because of the lack of any real sanitation practices. People didn't wash their hands after touching dead bodies or before eating. Public spaces were filled with waste and personal hygiene was an afterthought. In a time where people were already living in unsanitary conditions, the plague found fertile ground to spread. The towns were overcrowded, people lived in filthy conditions, and disease was an ever-present threat. But nothing could have prepared them for the devastating impact of the plague. As you move through the streets, you can almost hear the panic and fear that must have gripped the people during this time. The towns and villages were overwhelmed by death, and the response was chaotic. Mass graves were dug to bury the dead, and the very act of burying people became dangerous. In the face of the plague's fury, medieval people resorted to desperate measures. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the deadly disease. Others turned to religion, praying for divine intervention. Some even blamed outsiders or groups such as Jews, whom they thought were responsible for the plague. The chaos and fear only made the spread of the disease worse, as people fled towns, taking the disease with them. And yet, despite all of this, the plague eventually passed. It didn't disappear entirely, but the death toll slowed, and life in the medieval world began to slowly return to a grim form of normalcy. But the Black Plague left its mark, not just in the bodies it took, but in the psyche of the medieval world. It was a wake-up call, albeit a tragic one, that highlighted the inadequacies of medieval hygiene and sanitation practices. Historians still wonder if the plague would have been as devastating if people had understood the importance of cleanliness, sanitation, and disease transmission. Could better hygiene practices have slowed the spread? Perhaps, but it's hard to say. What's clear, though, is that the medieval world was woefully unprepared for such an event. People were caught in the grip of a disease they didn't understand, in a time when personal hygiene was a luxury, not a necessity. As you walk through the empty streets now, you realise the lasting impact the Black Plague had on the world. It wasn't just the millions of lives lost. It was the harsh lesson that hygiene, cleanliness, and sanitation are vital to survival. The plague became a turning point in history, a stark reminder of the importance of health and cleanliness. For the people of the medieval world, it was a wake-up call they couldn't ignore. And as you continue your journey through this world of filth, sweat, and disease, you can't help but be grateful for the advancements in hygiene that followed, the lessons learned from centuries of struggle and suffering. The Black Plague might have shaped the medieval world, but it also laid the foundation for the modern understanding of public health and sanitation. Perhaps it was the tragedy of this pandemic that eventually led to the improvements in hygiene practices we take for granted today. As you continue your walk through the medieval town, you approach the towering silhouette of a church. It stands at the centre of the town square, its spires reaching toward the heavens. The church, in many ways, was the spiritual heart of the medieval world. People would gather here to pray, seek comfort, and worship. But beyond its role in religious life, the church also played a central part in medieval attitudes toward hygiene, particularly when it came to bathing. You might imagine that the church, with its air of cleanliness and sanctity, would promote hygiene and cleanliness. After all, cleanliness is next to godliness, right? Well, not quite. As you step inside, the cool, damp air fills your lungs, and you notice the faint smell of wood, incense, and something else, something musk. The church is not exactly spotless, but that's not unusual for medieval times. The very idea of personal hygiene was, in many ways, at odds with the teachings of the church. While religious authorities preached purity and holiness, they did not necessarily advocate for cleanliness in the way we understand it today. In fact, during much of the medieval period, the church viewed bathing with suspicion. Early Christian thought linked water with physical indulgence, associating bathing with paganism and excess. To bathe, it was believed, was to indulge in vanity or pride, and these were seen as sins. Instead of bathing regularly, many Christians believed that suffering, abstinence, and modesty were far more virtuous. In fact, some church leaders even went so far as to discourage bathing altogether. Many monks, for example, would forgo bathing entirely, adhering to the idea that the body should be neglected in favour of spiritual devotion. Bathing was considered unnecessary, if not sinful, and the church preached that the soul was far more important than the body's hygiene. So even though churches themselves were often symbols of purity and sanctity, they didn't exactly promote clean living in the way we think of it today. Even within the walls of the church, the standards of hygiene were appallingly low. During religious services, the congregation would sit or kneel on hard pews or stone floors, and, without the luxury of modern plumbing, the area surrounding the church would quickly become dirty and unsanitary. The waste from the town, from human and animal sources, would often end up on the streets surrounding the church, creating an environment ripe for disease. The church, though an institution of power and influence, didn't have the resources or the inclination to improve hygiene. While the church didn't actively advocate for hygiene, it did promote a form of spiritual cleanliness. Rituals like confession and penance were meant to cleanse the soul, but there was little concern for cleansing the body. Even when it came to the sick, there was little understanding of hygiene. Disease was often seen as a punishment for sin, a divine retribution. The clergy would offer prayers for healing, but there was no concept of medicine as a tool to treat illness. As a result, sickness spread rapidly, especially in areas like monasteries, where the monks lived in close quarters and hygiene was practically non-existent. The church also had a significant role in shaping the way medieval people viewed disease. Many believed that sickness was a form of divine punishment, either for personal sins or for the sins of the community. The church would sometimes prescribe holy remedies, such as prayer, fasting, or pilgrimages to sacred sites, believing that these actions could cure the body and soul alike. It was during these times that the idea of cleanliness and purification was twisted into something otherworldly. Cleansing the body was not a matter of washing away dirt and germs, but a process of seeking forgiveness, of repenting and purifying oneself before God. There's a certain irony in all of this. The church, an institution that held so much power over people's lives, encouraged people to focus on their souls while ignoring their physical bodies. The emphasis was on spiritual purity, not cleanliness. If you were sick or dirty, it was a sign that you needed to purify your soul. This view helped to perpetuate the widespread neglect of hygiene in medieval society. People were told that washing wasn't necessary, that suffering was a virtuous act, and that true cleanliness came from within. Historians have long debated whether the church's stance on hygiene played a role in the spread of disease during the medieval period. Could more emphasis on cleanliness and sanitation have reduced the number of deaths from plague, cholera, or other diseases? It's impossible to say for certain, but it's clear that the church's refusal to acknowledge the importance of physical cleanliness contributed to a world where hygiene was considered secondary at best. The teachings of the church, particularly in the early medieval period, helped to foster an environment where disease could thrive, and the very idea of public health was practically non-existent. As you stand in the dimly lit church listening to the faint echoes of chanting from the monks, you can't help but feel a sense of irony. The church, a place of spiritual cleansing, seemed to offer little in the way of physical cleanliness. It was a symbol of holiness, yet the physical world around it remained filthy. The people who flocked to the church for spiritual guidance were just as likely to suffer from the consequences of poor hygiene as those who didn't attend. And even though the church held so much influence over people's lives, it didn't have the tools or the understanding to address the real problems of disease and sanitation. Historians still wonder how the church's teachings about cleanliness affected the health of the population. Could things have been different if hygiene had been prioritised as much as spiritual purity? Could the outbreaks of plague and disease have been less devastating if people had washed regularly, kept their living spaces cleaner, or paid attention to the sanitation of public areas? The answer to these questions remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. The medieval world, despite its strong religious presence, was a world where cleanliness was not seen as a necessity, but as a luxury few could afford. As you continue your journey through the medieval world, you begin to wonder, how on earth did people survive in such a filthy, unsanitary environment? You've seen the filth in the streets, the absence of proper sanitation, the lack of clean water, and the questionable hygiene practices. You've walked through crowded, disease-ridden towns, where people lived, worked, and socialised in a haze of unpleasant odours, germs, and pests. Yet despite all this, the medieval world wasn't just some grim suffering place. It was a thriving, dynamic society, one that persisted for centuries. The question remains, how did they do it? It's easy to assume that the medieval people were simply resigned to their circumstances, that they had no choice but to live in the dirt and squalor. But that doesn't fully explain how they managed to endure the constant discomfort and danger of disease. There must have been something in their daily lives that helped them survive the lack of sanitation, the absence of modern medicine, and the ever-present threat of illness. And as you continue through the streets, a thought begins to form in your mind. Perhaps medieval people had a resilience and understanding of life that we've lost in the modern world. Historians, doctors, and scholars have long debated how medieval people coped with their environment. Some argue that they simply had no idea of the risks associated with their lifestyle. Without the concept of germs or bacteria, they didn't understand how diseases spread or how important hygiene was to their health. Others suggest that they did understand that cleanliness mattered, but the tools and knowledge to implement real hygiene simply didn't exist. Still, there's something to be said for the survival instinct, the ability to adapt and endure in the face of hardship. Medieval people may not have had the luxury of modern sanitation, but they managed to survive. In fact, they did more than survive. They built empires, created art, and laid the groundwork for the societies that would come after them. You begin to realise that the medieval world, though dirty and uncomfortable by today's standards, was a world of resilience. People lived with the constant discomfort of pests, filth, and disease, but they adapted. They found ways to survive without the conveniences we now take for granted. They didn't have indoor plumbing, but they had communal wells, which despite their lack of cleanliness provided them with water. They didn't have soap as we know it, but they had basic cleaning methods, ashes, animal fats, herbs, that helped them keep the worst of the grime at bay. They didn't have modern medicine, but they had herbal remedies, potions, and superstitions that gave them a sense of control over their health. But despite this ingenuity, the fact remains that hygiene was not a priority in the medieval world. The wealthiest individuals might have had access to slightly better living conditions, but even they lived in a world where filth was a constant presence. The concept of cleanliness was limited to the occasional bath or a quick wash of the face and hands. People didn't wash their clothes regularly, they didn't wash their bodies regularly. The idea of personal hygiene as we know it today simply didn't exist. The lack of hygiene, combined with the overcrowding of medieval cities and the constant movement of people, made the spread of disease inevitable. Plagues, cholera, typhoid and dysentery were common, and they spread rapidly through towns and villages, leaving death in their wake. You can't help but think about the modern world's advances in hygiene, hand washing, antibiotics, vaccinations, and how these things have saved countless lives. In the medieval world, those same diseases ran rampant because people didn't understand the link between cleanliness and health. Disease was seen as a punishment or divine wrath, not as something that could be prevented through sanitation. Yet despite the apparent lack of hygiene, the medieval world wasn't just a cesspool of misery. People found joy in their daily lives, even if they were constantly surrounded by dirt and discomfort. They created art, literature and music. They built cities, fought wars and celebrated religious holidays. And they did it all while living in a world that was, by modern standards, incredibly unhygienic. This paradox, the ability to thrive in such a filthy environment, is what makes medieval hygiene so fascinating. Historians and scholars have tried to piece together how people in the medieval world managed to survive, let alone flourish, in such conditions. Some argue that they were simply more accustomed to dirt and disease, and their immune systems were better equipped to handle the challenges of the time. Others suggest that medieval people were just more resilient. They didn't have the luxury of modern conveniences, so they learned to cope with the discomfort and danger of their environment. It's also important to note that the medieval world was a far more spiritual place than ours. People placed their faith in God and believed that through prayer, fasting and penance, they could overcome the difficulties of life. In the absence of scientific knowledge, religion provided an important sense of hope and meaning. The church was the centre of life, offering solace, spiritual guidance, and, at times, the promise of salvation. For the medieval people, this sense of faith, combined with their resilience, may have been their greatest asset in surviving the harsh conditions around them. And so, as you walk through the streets of this medieval town, you start to appreciate the paradox of it all. Despite the dirt, the disease and the discomfort, people managed to live, work and thrive. They created civilizations without the hygiene practices we take for granted today. They didn't have modern medicine, but they found ways to survive, even in the face of death. The medieval world may have been a world of filth, but it was also a world of strength, resilience and survival. Historians still wonder if medieval hygiene could have been improved if people had better knowledge of germs and disease. Could the Black Plague have been less deadly if sanitation practices had been different? Could fewer people have died if bathing and personal cleanliness had been prioritised? The answers to these questions are lost to time, but one thing remains clear. The medieval world was a place where survival was a constant struggle and hygiene was something that few could afford. But despite it all, people persevered, creating the foundation for the modern world in the most unexpected of circumstances. As you step out of the medieval town and begin to leave behind the world of filth, disease and discomfort, you can't help but reflect on how far we've come. The modern world, with its access to clean water, hygiene products and sanitation systems, is a stark contrast to the medieval world you've just walked through. In the blink of an eye, you realise that something as simple as a hot shower or a clean toilet, things you may have taken for granted, would have been unimaginable to the people you've just observed. Looking back at the medieval world, it's easy to see how far we've come. Modern medicine, sanitation and hygiene practices have drastically changed the way we live. Diseases that once decimated populations now have vaccines and treatments. Simple practices like hand washing, sterilizing medical instruments, and keeping food and water clean have saved millions of lives. The very notion of hygiene, something so central to our lives today, was practically non-existent in the medieval world. And yet, despite this, the people of the past managed to survive, and in many ways thrive, in a world where hygiene was secondary to survival. Take a moment to imagine the comfort of a hot shower, the refreshing feeling of clean clothes, and the peace of mind that comes with knowing that you're not at risk of contracting a deadly disease just from walking down the street. In the medieval world, these comforts were simply out of reach. People lived with the constant discomfort of being dirty, living in unsanitary conditions and dealing with the risks of disease every day, but they didn't have the luxury of modern hygiene. They didn't have the knowledge of bacteria, or the concept of sanitation. What they did have was resilience. They survived in a world that was far less forgiving than the one we live in today. The impact of medieval hygiene, or lack thereof, can still be felt today. The outbreaks of disease, the high mortality rates, and the persistence of poverty in medieval society were all influenced by the conditions people lived in. While the advances in medicine and public health have dramatically improved our quality of life, the medieval world's struggles with hygiene remain a reminder of how far we've come and how much we owe to the pioneers who fought to improve public health. But what if we hadn't made these advancements? What if sanitation practices had never been developed? It's a chilling thought. The Black Plague, the cholera outbreaks, and the countless other diseases that ravaged the population could have been even more devastating if it weren't for the development of modern hygiene practices. We might not have had the population growth or the technological advancements that allowed us to create the world we live in today. Now, as you walk through the streets of the modern world, with clean sidewalks, well-maintained public spaces, and readily available water, you start to appreciate how much we've achieved. The luxury of clean water, proper sanitation, and access to medical care is something that not only improves our health but our quality of life. These are things we take for granted every day, things that medieval people could only dream of. But as you reflect on the medieval world, you can't help but appreciate the resilience of those who lived through it. Despite the unsanitary conditions, the diseases, and the constant threat of death, people managed to build societies, create art, and develop complex systems of governance. They didn't have the luxury of modern medicine, but they had grit. They didn't have the convenience of showers or clean clothes, but they had resourcefulness. They made do with what they had, and in doing so they laid the foundation for the world we live in today. As you continue your journey through this reflection, you can't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the modern conveniences we often overlook. The clean water that flows from our taps, the ability to visit a doctor when we're sick, and the simple joy of a hot bath are all things that we've come to expect. But as you remember the medieval world, you realise how fragile those comforts are. It wasn't always this way. It was the result of centuries of struggle, trial and error. It was the result of people learning from the mistakes of the past and pushing forward to create a better, healthier world. And so as you stand in this modern world, you realise that the past, with all its grime, its disease and its discomfort, has shaped who we are today. It has taught us the importance of hygiene, sanitation and public health. And in the end, it's a reminder that the fight for cleanliness, for health and for survival is one that has been ongoing for centuries. So as you go about your day, take a moment to appreciate the conveniences we often overlook. The clean water, the sanitary facilities, and the knowledge that we live in a world where hygiene is no longer an afterthought. And remember that comfort and cleanliness were once luxuries only made possible by the resilience and innovation of generations past. The medieval world may have been a place of filth and disease, but it was also a world that laid the foundation for the world we live in now. As you continue walking through the medieval landscape, you start to realise that the world you've been exploring was not just dirty, it was a system on the brink of transformation. The medieval period, despite its many struggles with hygiene, eventually gave way to the Renaissance, an era that saw the first sparks of progress in the understanding of science, medicine, and public health. But before this monumental shift, medieval hygiene was deeply entrenched in superstition, ignorance, and a lack of resources. As you look around, you realise that the decline of medieval hygiene wasn't just a result of personal neglect. It was part of a larger societal issue. It was, in many ways, a result of the slow an often painful transition from one era to the next. The medieval world was characterized by its lack of sanitation, with people relying on primitive methods to clean themselves and their surroundings. As you stand in the town square, watching the people move through the streets, it becomes clear that change was on the horizon. The decline of medieval hygiene wasn't a sudden shift. It was a gradual transformation that took centuries to unfold. The medieval period had been dominated by the belief that disease was a divine punishment, that suffering was a part of life, and that the body's cleanliness was secondary to the soul's purity. But as the Renaissance began to emerge, so too did new ways of thinking about health, hygiene, and cleanliness. You can almost hear the whispers of change in the air, the beginning of a revolution in thought. The rise of the medical profession and the burgeoning field of anatomy were making people question old beliefs. As the Renaissance flourished, there was a gradual recognition that disease could be prevented, that cleanliness mattered, and that the body should be treated with respect and care, not as something to be neglected or ignored. But before this revolution could truly take hold, there was still much to overcome. The centuries of neglect that had shaped medieval hygiene would not be undone overnight. As you continue your walk, you encounter more signs of this gradual decline. The town is full of people living in close quarters, with little access to fresh water or sanitation. But the world is changing slowly but surely. New ideas are emerging, fueled by the rediscovery of classical knowledge and the rise of humanism. People are beginning to challenge the status quo, asking questions about health, hygiene, and the body. You can feel the winds of change blowing, even if it's still a long way from reaching the people who live in the town. But despite the signs of progress, there is still resistance. The old ways die hard, and the medieval mindset about cleanliness and disease is deeply entrenched. As you look around, you can still see the remnants of the old world. People walking the streets with no knowledge of germ theory, no concept of sanitation, and no understanding of how disease spreads. The idea of hygiene, as we understand it today, is still a distant dream. People still wash infrequently, still live in crowded, unsanitary conditions, and still rely on superstition and prayer to cure illnesses. And yet, there are hints of change. The rise of universities and medical schools is beginning to push back against the old ways of thinking. The first glimmers of scientific thought are emerging, and with it the promise of a healthier, cleaner future. But that future is still a way off. The decline of medieval hygiene is a slow, uneven process, marked by resistance, ignorance, and the unwillingness to embrace new ideas. You begin to realise that the medieval period was a time of transition, an era stuck between the old ways and the new, a time when the foundation for modern hygiene and medicine was being laid, even if it wasn't yet fully understood. As you continue your journey, you reflect on how far we've come. The modern world, with its understanding of germs, hygiene, and public health, is a far cry from the medieval world you've just explored. But the transformation that took place over the centuries, ushered in by the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, one that required overcoming centuries of ignorance and superstition. The decline of medieval hygiene was not the end, but the beginning of something greater, a world where sanitation, cleanliness, and health would become central to the way people lived. You stand there, at the edge of the medieval world, looking back at what was, and forward to what could be. It's hard to imagine a time when people lived without the modern comforts we now take for granted. Clean water, proper sanitation, and an understanding of disease prevention, these are the cornerstones of modern society, and they didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were the result of centuries of struggle, trial and error. The decline of medieval hygiene was a painful but necessary step in the evolution of human understanding. And though it took time, the lessons learned from that grim, unsanitary past eventually paved the way for the world we know today. As you reflect on the transformation from the medieval world to the modern age, you realise that hygiene is more than just a matter of cleanliness. It's a reflection of our understanding of health, our respect for the body, and our ability to adapt to new knowledge. The decline of medieval hygiene was not just about dirt and disease, it was about changing the way people thought about themselves and their place in the world. It was about moving from a time of ignorance to a time of discovery, from a world of filth to a world of cleanliness. And so, as you stand on the threshold of the modern world, you can't help but appreciate the progress that has been made. You have clean water, a comfortable home, and the knowledge that you live in a world where hygiene is no longer an afterthought. But you also remember the medieval world with its filth, its disease, and its struggle for survival. It's a world that laid the groundwork for the modern world we live in today, and for that it deserves to be remembered. As you walk further into the heart of the medieval town, you start to notice how much the urban environment plays a role in the state of hygiene. The town is alive with activity, filled with people going about their daily tasks, merchants shouting to sell their wares, children running through the streets, animals roaming freely. But beneath the lively exterior, you can see that the town itself is both a blessing and a curse when it comes to hygiene. The rise of towns in the medieval period marked the beginning of a new chapter in human history, but it also introduced a host of new problems when it came to sanitation. Before the rise of towns, people mostly lived in rural settings, where they could afford more space and have a certain degree of distance from one another. Hygiene, such as it was a bit more manageable in the countryside. But as towns began to grow, often overcrowded, and poorly planned, sanitation issues became much more difficult to ignore. The towns themselves were often built without any understanding of proper waste disposal or water management, and as a result, filth and disease spread rapidly. You can feel the chaos of the medieval town as you make your way through the crowded streets. The roads are narrow, the buildings are packed closely together, and the noise is deafening. The market square is busy with vendors trying to sell their goods, but as you look around you start to notice how unsanitary it all is. People live close to each other, and the lack of privacy means that there's little distinction between where someone eats, sleeps, or works. There's no real sanitation system. Waste is thrown into the streets, animals roam freely, and public health is hardly a priority. The rise of medieval towns created a new set of problems when it came to hygiene. As more and more people moved into urban areas, the infrastructure needed to support them simply didn't exist. Roads were packed with refuse, and there was no real system in place to manage waste. Towns often lacked the basic plumbing that would be needed to transport clean water, and there were no proper sewage systems to carry waste away. The stench of decaying food, human waste, and dead animals hung in the air, and it became a breeding ground for disease. But towns weren't all bad. They also became centres of commerce, culture, and innovation. The growth of towns meant that people were able to interact more, trade goods, and share ideas in ways that weren't possible in rural areas. The medieval town became a hub for the development of new technologies and the expansion of knowledge. But in many ways, the rapid growth of towns was a double-edged sword, as the overcrowding and poor hygiene created the perfect environment for disease to spread. You can't help but think about the resilience of the people who lived in these conditions. Despite the lack of clean water, proper sanitation, and basic hygiene, they continued to build and expand their towns. They developed their markets, created their guilds, and laid the foundation for the societies that would emerge in later centuries. But it wasn't easy. Disease outbreaks were common, and people didn't have the means to protect themselves from the filth and germs that were all around them. Public health was essentially non-existent, and sanitation was not something anyone thought to prioritise. Still, towns became the beating heart of medieval life. Even in the midst of filth and disease, people found ways to create a sense of community. There were religious institutions, such as churches and monasteries, that provided some semblance of order and cleanliness. The church played a central role in the development of towns, and many towns were built around religious centres. The church was often responsible for some form of public health, such as the care of the sick or the establishment of hospital-like facilities. But these efforts were minimal, and the overall conditions of the town were still grim. Over time, the situation in the towns began to improve, albeit slowly. The medieval world began to shift as new ideas and innovations started to take hold. Hygiene, though still a distant concept, started to be discussed more seriously. With the rise of universities and scientific knowledge, people began to realise that diseases were not just divine punishments, but could be prevented through better living conditions and better sanitation. However, it would take centuries before these ideas were fully implemented. Historians often debate how much the growth of towns contributed to the spread of disease. Was it simply the fact that people lived too closely together? Or did the poor living conditions actually make things worse? Some scholars argue that the urban environment created by medieval towns was a breeding ground for illness, while others suggest that the rise of commerce and intellectual exchange helped to push forward ideas that would eventually lead to a better understanding of hygiene and public health. As you stand in the midst of the bustling medieval town, it's hard not to feel a sense of wonder at the sheer resilience of the people who lived here. They endured the filth, the overcrowding and the disease, yet they still managed to build a society that, in many ways, laid the groundwork for the modern world. The rise of towns in the medieval period was a pivotal moment in history, and while it brought with it new problems, it also set the stage for the innovations and advancements that would eventually shape the future. As you continue your journey through the medieval world, the path leads you to a critical turning point in the understanding of hygiene: medicine. In the modern world, we take for granted the idea of visiting a doctor when we're sick, knowing that healthcare and hygiene are intrinsically linked. But in medieval times, the concept of hygiene in medicine was rudimentary at best, and medical practices often bordered on superstition, trial and error. The role of physicians, apothecaries and healers was vastly different from what we understand today. You step into the heart of a bustling medieval medical practice, and the first thing you notice is the chaotic, unsanitary atmosphere. The room is filled with jars of dried herbs, vials of strange substances, and worn wooden tables. A few tattered books sit on a shelf, their pages yellowed with age. The air is thick with the smell of old remedies, alcohol, herbs, and something more medicinal but slightly off-putting. The doctor, or more likely the physician, seems preoccupied with mixing potions and concoctions, his hands moving in a blur. He looks up at you briefly before returning to his work. His robe is stained with the residue of various tinctures and medicines, and his hands seem just as dirty as those of the patients he treats. In the medieval period, hygiene in medicine was practically non-existent. Physicians often lacked the understanding of disease that we have today. While the wealthy had access to trained physicians, the majority of the population had to rely on local healers or apothecaries, people who often had no formal training, but relied on old folk remedies and herbal concoctions. Even the most educated doctors had little understanding of germs or sanitation. The concept of cleanliness in medical practices simply wasn't part of the conversation. Surgical instruments were reused without being sterilised, and bandages or linens were often reused without being cleaned. The idea of hygiene in a medical setting, keeping tools clean, washing hands before treating patients, was a foreign concept. At this point in history, medicine and hygiene were still seen as separate entities. It wasn't uncommon for a doctor to treat a patient in a filthy, cluttered space, and the lack of hygiene in these medical settings often led to complications. In fact, it wasn't unusual for patients to contract infections from the very instruments used to treat them. Bloodletting, one of the most common medical treatments of the time, was often done with unclean tools, leading to further health issues. Without any understanding of how infections spread, physicians were oblivious to the dangers of dirty hands, unsterilised instruments and unsanitary conditions. You imagine a patient walking into this room, sick or injured, seeking relief. The physician, though well-intentioned, has no concept of cleanliness or sanitation. The very act of treatment could lead to further illness. The tools used in surgery, whether a simple knife or a bone saw, are blunt, rusty and unclean. When bloodletting is performed, the same instruments are used on multiple patients, increasing the risk of infection. Yet despite all of this, many medieval people trusted their physicians. They didn't know any better. Doctors were highly regarded in medieval society, often revered as the best hope for healing, even if the methods they used were not always effective and sometimes even dangerous. Medieval medicine was often focused on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. It was believed that disease resulted from an imbalance in these humours, and treatment typically involved attempts to restore balance. Bloodletting, purging and vomiting were common practices. While some of these treatments might have worked for minor ailments, they were incredibly dangerous when applied to more serious conditions. Without the benefit of modern antibiotics or pain management, patients were often subjected to treatments that made them more uncomfortable, if not worse. The idea of infection didn't exist in the minds of medieval people. They believed that disease was a result of an imbalance in the body, or sometimes a punishment from God. As you observe the medieval medical practice, it's clear that hygiene wasn't even part of the equation. While some apothecaries made efforts to keep their tools organised, the practice of sanitation wasn't seen as necessary for healing. There was no sterilisation process for tools, and medicines were often prepared in unsanitary conditions. Herbs and potions, many of which were probably ineffective or harmful, were stored in jars that may not have been properly sealed, exposing them to contamination. The idea of clean, sterile conditions simply didn't exist. Instead, the focus was on curing the body through a variety of means, most of which were based on superstition and limited knowledge of anatomy and disease. You begin to realise just how little medieval medicine had in common with what we know today. The doctors, while often educated in ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, had no understanding of germs, bacteria or viruses. They used methods that were sometimes ineffective and at other times outright harmful. But despite the lack of knowledge and hygiene, these medical practitioners were still seen as important figures. The common folk would visit them for everything from toothaches to fevers, and even childbirth. The medicine was primitive, and hygiene was often an afterthought, but it was the best the medieval world had to offer. Historians still debate how medieval people managed to survive under such unhygienic conditions, especially when it came to medical care. How did they cope with infections, diseases, and the constant threat of illness in a world where cleanliness wasn't a priority? The answer, in many ways, is that they didn't always survive. People died from infections that we would now consider treatable, and diseases spread rapidly due to the lack of hygiene. But somehow, through it all, people lived, and the practice of medicine continued to evolve, albeit slowly. The knowledge gained from centuries of trial and error eventually laid the foundation for the modern understanding of medicine and hygiene. As you step out of the doctor's office, you realise how far we've come. The simple act of washing your hands before treating a patient, the use of sterile instruments, and the development of antibiotics and vaccines have transformed medicine in ways that medieval people could never have imagined. The medieval world, despite its failures in hygiene, paved the way for the advancements we take for granted today. It was a world of ignorance, superstition, and grime, but it was also a world that set the stage for the modern era of science and medicine. The medieval period may have been a time of darkness in terms of hygiene, but it was also the birthplace of the medical advancements that would change the world forever. As you walk through the bustling medieval town, you notice the significant presence of women in every corner of society. They are running the shops, preparing food, raising children, and working alongside men in nearly every aspect of life. But one thing becomes clear as you observe them. Hygiene was just as much their responsibility as anyone else's, yet it was often a luxury that many women simply couldn't afford. The role of women in medieval hygiene is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of this period. Women, despite their critical role in the household and society, had little control over the cleanliness and sanitation of their environments, yet they bore the brunt of the consequences. Women in the medieval world were largely responsible for the household. This meant not only taking care of the children, preparing meals and managing the household's daily tasks, but also ensuring that the home was clean, or at least as clean as possible. In a world where access to water was limited, and soap was a rare commodity, the responsibility of maintaining cleanliness fell heavily on the women of the household. They washed the clothes, scrubbed the floors, and tended to the sick, but their resources were limited. Even with all their effort, the idea of cleanliness in the medieval world was often unattainable, and women were left to deal with the consequences. As you move through the narrow streets of the town, you begin to notice women tending to their daily chores, many of them working in the open air, washing clothes in communal rivers, or fetching water from the well. You can see how physically demanding their work must have been. They fill large buckets of water, carrying them back to their homes, sometimes several times a day. In many cases, the water they fetched was contaminated with waste, yet it was their only option. The women, despite their best efforts, had to make do with the water they had access to, which, more often than not, was far from clean. For many women, ensuring the cleanliness of their families meant making difficult choices between using limited water supplies for washing, cooking, or drinking. The burden on women didn't end with household chores. During childbirth, women played a pivotal role in the hygiene and health of the family, even though their knowledge of sanitation was limited. Midwives, often older women with experience but little formal training, would assist with births in homes where cleanliness was barely a consideration. The birthing process was dirty, painful, and risky, with little understanding of the importance of sterilising instruments or maintaining a sterile environment. The midwife would often use the same cloth to wipe the woman's sweat and blood, with no real concern for the spread of infection. The mortality rate during childbirth was high, and many women did not survive, either due to the lack of proper care or the infections that would follow after the birth. Yet, despite the unsanitary conditions, women continued to have children, continuing the cycle of life in a world where hygiene was just another challenge they faced daily. Women also played a crucial role in caring for the sick, often administering herbal remedies and basic treatments to family members who fell ill. You see women in the town's market selling dried herbs, potions and tinctures that they had prepared at home. While some of these remedies were effective for minor ailments, they were no match for the rampant diseases that plagued the medieval world. The lack of understanding of germ theory and the spread of disease meant that women, despite their hard work and care, were often unable to protect their families from illness. They would tend to the sick, try to comfort them and administer remedies, but often with little success. Many women lost loved ones to diseases that could have been prevented had they known more about hygiene or had access to modern medicine. And yet, despite all of these challenges, women were the backbone of the medieval household. They did everything in their power to maintain the cleanliness of their homes, care for their families, and keep their communities running. They found ways to survive in a world that was dirty, unsanitary, and full of risks. They understood on some level the importance of cleanliness, but they lacked the knowledge to make it a reality. In a world where sanitation was largely ignored, women were the ones who worked tirelessly to create some semblance of order in the midst of chaos. Historians still debate the role women played in the development of hygiene practices in medieval times. Some argue that women were more aware of the importance of cleanliness than we give them credit for, while others suggest that their limited knowledge of hygiene may have contributed to the spread of disease. What is clear, however, is that women were at the heart of medieval hygiene practices. They worked to maintain cleanliness in a world that often had little understanding of sanitation, and they did so with limited resources and often dangerous conditions. As you reflect on the role women played in medieval hygiene, you begin to appreciate the resilience and strength they demonstrated. Despite the hardships they faced, women in the medieval world kept their families alive, kept their homes running and did their best to maintain some level of cleanliness, even when the world around them made it nearly impossible. They didn't have access to the modern tools and knowledge we take for granted today, but they found ways to survive. In many ways, the history of hygiene in the medieval world is also the history of women. Resilient, resourceful, and determined in the face of overwhelming challenges. In the end, the medieval period was a time of immense hardship, especially when it came to hygiene. But it was also a time of innovation, survival, and adaptation. The women who lived in this world, who shouldered the burden of hygiene and care for their families, were a testament to the resilience of humanity in the face of adversity. And though the medieval world may have been grimy, dirty, and disease-ridden, it was also a world of hard work, survival, and perseverance, qualities that women carried with them every day as they played a crucial role in the health and hygiene of the medieval world. As you walk deeper into the medieval world, you begin to sense the subtle stirrings of change, the first inklings of progress amidst the chaos of filth, disease, and ignorance. The medieval period, though marked by a lack of hygiene and understanding of disease, was not a stagnant one. It was a time of intellectual and cultural transformation, even if it wasn't immediately clear in the everyday lives of the people. For much of the era, sanitation and hygiene were seen as irrelevant concerns compared to more pressing issues like war, famine, and religious upheaval. But beneath the surface, the very challenges that plagued the people, the diseases, the suffering, and the constant battle for survival were beginning to stir something greater, the seed of scientific thought. You can almost hear the whispers of change as you walk past the university in the town square. The medieval world may have been largely ignorant of germs and hygiene, but it was also a time when knowledge began to be valued. Universities, although few and far between, were slowly beginning to emerge. Here, scholars would gather to study the classical works of Greek and Roman thinkers. They might not have had the knowledge we possess today, but the process of inquiry, the questioning of the world around them, was beginning. The intellectual climate was slowly shifting, and with it came the beginnings of an understanding that the world could be studied, analysed, and eventually understood. The first stirrings of what would eventually become modern science were beginning to take root. While medieval doctors and healers still relied heavily on superstition and religious explanations for disease, there was a growing interest in rational thought, in the pursuit of knowledge beyond the confines of religious dogma. The rise of universities in Europe, particularly in places like Bologna and Paris, marked the beginning of a new way of thinking, a way that would eventually lead to breakthroughs in medicine, hygiene, and public health. You pause to observe a small group of scholars gathered in the courtyard, deep in conversation. They are discussing ancient texts, debating theories and exchanging ideas. The air is filled with an almost palpable sense of curiosity. These early scholars, while far removed from the breakthroughs of modern science, are laying the groundwork for future discoveries. They are beginning to ask the questions that will eventually lead to the understanding of sanitation, hygiene, and disease. They may not know it yet, but the very foundations of medicine are being built here, in the minds of those who seek knowledge. But the road to progress is long and fraught with resistance. In the medieval world, knowledge was often controlled by the church, which was deeply invested in maintaining religious teachings over scientific inquiry. The church, despite its contributions to the preservation of knowledge, often viewed any challenge to its authority with suspicion. The idea that hygiene and disease could be explained by natural causes rather than divine punishment was not a welcome one. The prevailing belief that illness was a manifestation of sin or divine retribution stood in the way of a deeper understanding of public health. Still, the seeds of change were being planted. One of the most notable early thinkers to question the status quo was the physician and scholar Avicenna, whose work on medicine and hygiene laid the groundwork for future medical practices. Though Avicenna lived far from medieval Europe, his ideas were highly influential, particularly in the fields of disease transmission and hygiene. He was among the first to recognise that diseases could be spread through contagion, not just by divine will or imbalanced humours. While his theories were not immediately accepted in the West, they marked an important shift in medical thinking. In the medieval period, hygiene and cleanliness were still largely ignored by most of the population. But slowly the idea that health could be protected by proper care, sanitation, and disease prevention began to emerge. It wasn't an easy transition. The medieval world was stuck in its ways, clinging to old beliefs and practices. But the intellectual ferment that began to take place in the universities, the scholarly interest in ancient texts, and the growing understanding of disease all began to form the bedrock of modern sanitation practices. Historians still wonder whether the rise of early scientific thought in the medieval period was enough to stem the tide of disease and improve public health. Could the intellectual movements of the time have prevented the plagues and epidemics that ravaged Europe? It's impossible to say for certain, but one thing is clear: the battle for hygiene and sanitation was just beginning. It would take centuries of scientific progress, of trial and error, before modern sanitation practices would come to fruition. But the groundwork for these developments was laid in the minds of thinkers, scholars, and physicians who questioned the status quo, challenged old beliefs, and sought to understand the world in new ways. As you continue to walk through the medieval streets, you begin to see a glimmer of hope. Despite the overwhelming filth and disease, there are signs of progress. The first stirrings of scientific inquiry, the growing interest in medicine and hygiene, and the rise of universities are all part of a larger transformation, a shift toward a more rational scientific understanding of the world. The medieval period may have been dirty, grimy, and disease-ridden, but it was also the beginning of something new. The foundations for modern science were being built in the most unexpected of places, and in the midst of all the suffering and filth, change was on the horizon. The road to better hygiene and sanitation was a long one, and the medieval period was a crucial part of that journey. The people of the time may not have had the answers, but they were beginning to ask the right questions. It would take centuries of struggle, of trial and error, before modern sanitation practices were fully realised. But the intellectual movements of the medieval period were the first steps in a long and arduous journey toward the world we live in today. As you walk through the medieval town, observing the bustling marketplace, the cramped houses, and the unsanitary conditions, you begin to realise something crucial. The lack of hygiene didn't just affect the people's comfort or their quality of life, it affected their very survival. Medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, had hidden costs that permeated every aspect of society. Diseases spread rapidly, public health was compromised, and the economic, social, and cultural consequences were far-reaching. Hygiene wasn't just a matter of personal cleanliness, it was a fundamental issue that shaped the very structure of medieval life. The most immediate cost of poor hygiene was, of course, disease. You've seen firsthand how the streets are filled with waste, human, animal, and discarded food. The lack of proper sanitation, clean water, and waste disposal systems made it easy for disease to spread. Public spaces became breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses, and the idea of personal. Cleanliness was practically non-existent. In a world where people lived in close quarters, sharing homes and public spaces, disease transmission was inevitable. You see families living in small, poorly ventilated homes, often with multiple generations under one roof. The air is thick with the smell of dampness, sweat, and unwashed bodies. There's no concept of cleaning the air, and the same diseases that spread through the streets also found their way into the homes. It's easy to imagine how this environment made the perfect conditions for illnesses like dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera to thrive. People were constantly exposed to disease, and survival was often a matter of luck. But it wasn't just the common illnesses that took a toll on the people. The medieval period was also marked by devastating plagues, like the Black Death, which decimated entire communities. The lack of hygiene practices made the spread of the plague even more deadly. In the absence of basic medical care, the plague became a force of nature, claiming millions of lives in just a few years. The impact of these epidemics wasn't just felt in the number of lives lost, it also disrupted entire societies. The economy suffered, trade routes were abandoned, and whole regions were left devastated by the loss of workers, farmers, and artisans. The costs of poor hygiene weren't just in the suffering of individuals, they were in the collapse of entire social and economic systems. You begin to wonder, could the plague have been avoided, or at least mitigated if people had known more about hygiene? Could sanitation have stopped the spread of disease? The answer is, of course, complicated. In the medieval world, the knowledge of hygiene and disease was limited. People didn't know about germs, bacteria, or viruses. They didn't understand how diseases spread through contact or contaminated water. And without that knowledge, it's hard to imagine that any amount of hygiene would have been able to stop the devastating effects of the Black Death. But even beyond disease, the lack of hygiene had other, less visible costs. Poor sanitation affected people's quality of life on a daily basis. People were constantly uncomfortable, living in a world where disease, pests, and filth were an ever-present threat. The stench of waste permeated the air, and the lack of clean water made it difficult to perform even the most basic of tasks. Women, who were largely responsible for maintaining the household, had to contend with the constant pressure of keeping their homes clean, despite having few resources to do so. They spent hours fetching water, washing clothes, and cooking meals in conditions that were far from ideal. But even their best efforts couldn't overcome the underlying problems of hygiene. As you observe the people going about their daily lives, you realise how much the medieval world was shaped by the lack of hygiene. The economic strain caused by constant disease outbreaks, the social disruption that followed plagues, and the toll it took on the lives of individuals and families all had far-reaching effects. The hidden costs of poor hygiene weren't just in the suffering of the sick, they were in the disruption of the very fabric of society. Towns and villages could collapse under the weight of disease, economies could falter, and social structures could be upended. The cost of hygiene, or the lack thereof, was immeasurable in terms of both human lives and societal stability. Yet even in the face of these challenges, the medieval world carried on. The people, despite the constant threat of disease, found ways to survive. They developed their own methods of coping with the conditions they faced. They created remedies from herbs, relied on religious practices for comfort and healing, and found ways to endure the constant discomfort of living in a world that was not kind to their health. But it's impossible not to wonder, how much of their suffering could have been prevented if hygiene had been a priority? As you reflect on the hidden costs of medieval hygiene, you begin to appreciate the incredible advancements we've made in sanitation and public health. The modern world, with its clean water, advanced medical practices, and sanitation systems, seems like a distant dream compared to the harsh realities of the medieval period. But those advancements didn't come easily. They were built upon centuries of struggle, trial and error. The medieval world, with its filth and disease, laid the groundwork for the innovations that would eventually transform public health and hygiene. In the end, the costs of medieval hygiene were high. They were measured not only in the lives lost to disease, but in the social and economic disruptions that followed. It wasn't just about keeping people clean, it was about creating a healthier, more stable society. The lack of hygiene in the medieval world didn't just affect the people who lived through it, it affected generations to come. And it wasn't until the modern era that hygiene began to be understood as a critical part of public health. The medieval world may have been a time of filth and disease, but it was also a time that set the stage for the healthier, cleaner world we live in today. As you continue to journey through the medieval world, your mind keeps returning to the catastrophic event that left an indelible mark on the era, the Black Death. The plague that ravaged Europe in the 14th century reshaped the medieval landscape in ways that can't be overstated. As you walk down the now quiet streets of this town, you can almost feel the weight of the past pressing on you, as if the horrors of that time still linger in the air. The Black Death was not just a devastating loss of life, it was a turning point in how people thought about hygiene, health, and society itself. The plague didn't just wipe out entire families, villages, or towns, it obliterated entire social systems. The medieval world, with its entrenched class hierarchies, had long relied on the peasantry to maintain the economy, grow food, and produce goods. But with the death toll mounting, a dramatic shift began to take place. The sudden loss of so many workers led to labour shortages, causing economic disruption across the continent. The Black Death served as a cruel reminder that the lack of proper hygiene, specifically sanitation and waste management, was a key factor in its rapid spread. With little understanding of disease transmission, medieval people were essentially defenceless against a plague that could spread quickly through cities with dense populations, poor sanitation, and no effective medical treatments. As you walk through the town, you begin to grasp just how integral hygiene was to the devastation of the plague. The lack of clean water, the absence of sanitation systems, and the close quarters in which people lived all contributed to the speed at which the disease spread. Public spaces were filthy, and waste was left to accumulate in the streets. It's no wonder that the disease spread so quickly. People were living in an environment ripe for infection. The spread of fleas, rats, and other pests, combined with poor sanitation practices, became a perfect storm for the plague to thrive. It's almost as though the world had been waiting for a tragedy like the Black Death to occur. The Black Death wasn't just a health crisis, it was a crisis that exposed the inadequacies of the medieval world's infrastructure. Towns, which had been growing rapidly in the centuries leading up to the plague, were poorly prepared for such an event. There were no sewers, no proper waste disposal systems, and no clean drinking water. People didn't know how to protect themselves from infection, and hygiene was still seen as a secondary concern to religious devotion or the more immediate needs of survival. In the wake of the plague, the deficiencies in medieval hygiene practices became glaringly apparent, and for the first time there was a collective reckoning with the understanding that the filth of the world could be as deadly as the sword. In the aftermath of the Black Death, there was a significant shift in attitudes toward hygiene and public health. People began to understand that cleanliness was no longer a luxury or an afterthought, it was a necessity. As the survivors of the plague picked up the pieces of their lives, the social and economic structures began to change. The labour shortages created by the death toll led to shifts in the workforce, with peasants demanding higher wages and better living conditions. The traditional feudal system began to unravel, and for the first time there was a genuine recognition of the connection between hygiene, health, and overall well-being. The survivors began to realise that keeping their homes and streets clean, something that had previously been seen as a minor concern, could actually protect them from the threat of future pandemics. The legacy of the Black Death on hygiene is complex. While the event led to greater awareness of public health issues, the changes were slow to take root. In the years following the plague, there was some improvement in sanitation practices. Public health measures like quarantine and isolation were implemented in response to future outbreaks. In some places, authorities began to take more active roles in managing waste, cleaning streets, and ensuring that towns were better prepared for future outbreaks. But these changes were not universal, and in many areas, hygiene practices remained rudimentary. The medieval world had not yet fully grasped the importance of sanitation in disease prevention, but the seeds for change were planted. You begin to wonder how different the medieval world would have been if the lessons of the Black Death had been fully embraced. What if hygiene, sanitation, and public health had been prioritised long before the plague? Could the deaths have been reduced? Could the social and economic upheaval have been mitigated? It's a sobering thought to consider, and one that reminds you of the immense impact that hygiene and sanitation have on public health, both in the past and in the present. As you walk through the streets of this town, you can almost hear the echoes of the past, the cries of the sick, the mourning for lost loved ones, and the panic that gripped the population as the Black Death swept through. The toll it took on the population was staggering. but it also served as a catalyst for change. It forced people to confront the realities of their environment, to face the fact that living in filth and ignorance of hygiene had severe consequences. Historians and public health experts still debate whether the Black Death could have been prevented if medieval people had better hygiene practices, better sanitation systems, and a deeper understanding of disease. What is clear, however, is that the Black Death forced a reckoning with the state of public health in the medieval world. The aftermath of the plague marked the beginning of a slow, gradual shift in how people thought about cleanliness, health, and the world around them. As you leave the town, your mind lingers on the legacy of the Black Death. It was a tragic chapter in history, one that cost millions of lives, but it was also a turning point. The lessons learned from the devastation of the plague would eventually lead to a greater understanding of hygiene, sanitation, and public health. Though it took centuries for modern hygiene practices to fully take hold, the Black Death was the catalyst for a change, reminding us that the battle for cleanliness is one that has always been a matter of life and death. As you continue your journey through this medieval world, you can't help but notice the slowly shifting landscape, the beginnings of a transformation in the way hygiene and sanitation are approached. The effects of the Black Death have rippled through the social fabric, leaving behind lessons that, while painfully learned, would eventually shape a new world order. While it would take centuries for the modern concept of hygiene to take hold, the medieval world was not entirely without hope. As you pass through the town, you sense that the groundwork for future improvements in public health is beginning to take shape. The early steps toward change are evident in the gradual adoption of quarantine measures. After the Black Death, there was a growing understanding that disease could be controlled, at least to some extent, by isolating the sick and taking precautions to limit the spread of illness. Quarantine laws were introduced in many towns and cities, though they were often rudimentary. The word quarantine itself, derived from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40, referred to the 40-day isolation period that ships and travellers from infected areas had to undergo before entering a town. This early form of disease control, though primitive by modern standards, was a crucial first step in managing public health and preventing future outbreaks. You notice that these quarantine laws, while limited, are a major shift in thinking. The idea that isolation could help prevent the spread of disease is revolutionary. People are starting to recognise that the solution to public health problems may lie in controlling the spread of illness, rather than simply praying for divine intervention. This small but significant change is the first real sign that hygiene and sanitation are no longer seen as secondary concerns. The people are beginning to realise that managing cleanliness and public health is not just a matter of personal survival, it's a matter of communal survival. This transition, however gradual, is a pivotal moment in the history of hygiene. Still, these early efforts are imperfect. The majority of medieval towns and villages lack the infrastructure to properly manage waste or provide clean drinking water. You can see that the streets are still littered with refuse, and the public baths, while more common than before, are still overcrowded and unsanitary. Even though the idea of quarantine is taking hold, the conditions outside of isolated spaces remain grim. For most of the population, personal hygiene is still a luxury, yet there's a growing sense that things must change, and they will, slowly over time. As you observe the townspeople continuing their daily lives, you realise that hygiene is still not a priority for many of them. The rich may have the luxury of better hygiene practices, but for the common folk, cleanliness is still a struggle. They continue to rely on traditional methods, scrubbing with rough brushes, using herbs to mask odours, and washing only when absolutely necessary. The idea of regular baths and hand washing is still foreign, and public health is often left to chance. Yet there's an undeniable undercurrent of change. The early stirrings of modern hygiene are here, but they're still in their infancy, waiting for the scientific revolution and the Renaissance to push them forward. Over the coming centuries, this gradual shift in understanding would give rise to public health reforms, innovations in sanitation, and eventually the development of modern hygiene practices. But for now, the medieval world is stuck in the transition between ignorance and progress. As you walk through the town, you can almost feel the tension in the air. The old world is passing away, and a new world is beginning to emerge. The shift from a time of ignorance and superstition to one of scientific inquiry and public health is happening, albeit slowly and with many setbacks. One of the most notable transformations to come out of this era is the establishment of hospitals. Before the medieval period, hospitals were primarily religious institutions, offering care to the poor, sick, and pilgrims. However, as the understanding of disease and hygiene began to evolve, hospitals started to take on a more practical role in public health. They began to move beyond their religious origins and became places for medical care, albeit still primitive by modern standards. These early hospitals were still plagued by poor hygiene, but they represented a major shift in how societies viewed the sick and the idea of caring for the ill. Despite the primitive conditions of early hospitals, the concept of medical care in a designated space was revolutionary. The sick were no longer confined to their homes or forced to rely solely on herbal remedies and superstitions. For the first time, institutions were set up specifically to care for the sick, and while their hygiene practices left much to be desired, they laid the foundation for modern hospitals and healthcare systems. In a sense, these institutions were the forerunners of the sanitation systems we now take for granted. They were a start, a small but important step toward the development of public health systems that would eventually lead to a cleaner, healthier world. You begin to understand that the journey to modern hygiene didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, often painful process. The medieval period may have been grimy, disease-ridden, and plagued by ignorance, but it was also a time of change. The foundations for modern medicine, public health and hygiene were laid, albeit imperfectly, and the lessons learned during this period would eventually lead to the sanitation practices we now rely on. The medieval world may have been a world of filth, but it was also a world of progress, however halting and uneven, that eventually brought us to where we are today. As you reflect on the legacy of the medieval world, you realise how much it shaped the world we live in now. The progress made in hygiene, sanitation and medicine is a direct result of the struggles, mistakes and discoveries of the past. The medieval world, for all its dirt and disease, was not without its contributions to the evolution of public health. And though it would take centuries for those contributions to fully take shape, they were the first steps on a path that would eventually lead to the modern world we know today. As you walk away from the medieval town, the echoes of the past begin to fade, replaced by the hum of the modern world. The contrast is staggering. Clean streets, well-maintained buildings, modern plumbing and sanitation systems surround you, and for the first time in your journey, you begin to appreciate just how far we've come. What once seemed like an insurmountable struggle, living with filth, disease and a complete lack of hygiene, is now a distant memory. But the journey to this point wasn't easy, and the progress we take for granted today was hard-earned, built on the foundations laid by those who lived through the medieval period. The medieval world, with all its dirt, disease and discomfort, was the birthplace of the public health and hygiene practices that would eventually save millions of lives. It was a world where basic cleanliness was a luxury, not a given. Yet despite these challenges, the medieval period set the stage for the advancements in sanitation that would change the course of human history. The rise of scientific thought, the early development of medical care, and the gradual shift in understanding disease all began in the unlikeliest of places, a world mired in filth, ignorance and superstition. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, may have claimed millions of lives, but it also served as a wake-up call. It highlighted the need for better public health systems, sanitation practices, and disease control. The aftermath of the plague sparked a re-evaluation of hygiene, and though it took centuries for real change to occur, the lessons learned from this catastrophic event laid the groundwork for the development of modern public health. As you stand in the modern world, you realise that the advances in hygiene and sanitation we now enjoy are the result of centuries of struggle. The development of antibiotics, the invention of vaccines, the establishment of public health systems, and the creation of sanitation infrastructure are all built on the failures and successes of the past. The medieval world may have been dirty and disease-ridden, but it was also a world of resilience and progress. It's easy to look back on that era and judge it harshly, but in doing so we risk forgetting how far we've come, and how much of our modern world was shaped by those who lived through it. Modern hygiene is something we often take for granted, but it wasn't always this way. The clean water we drink, the toilets we use, the healthcare systems that protect us, these are all luxuries that didn't exist in the medieval world. They were developed over centuries, through trial and error, and through the slow accumulation of knowledge. The concept of sanitation, the understanding that cleanliness and disease prevention are crucial to human survival, has become a cornerstone of modern life. And while we're far from perfect, the progress we've made is undeniable. You begin to see that the history of hygiene is not just about cleaning the streets, washing the hands or keeping disease at bay. It's a story about how society has evolved. It's about how we've learned to value our health, how we've built systems that protect us, and how we've developed the tools and knowledge to prevent the spread of disease. From the medieval towns to the Renaissance to the birth of modern science, the journey of hygiene is a journey of human progress. It's a journey that has taken centuries, but it's one that has been worth every step. But as you think about the modern world, you also realise that the struggle for better hygiene and public health isn't over. The challenges we face today, pandemics, environmental issues, and access to clean water, are reminders that the battle for hygiene and health continues. The modern world has made incredible strides, but we are still fighting for the same things that people in the medieval world fought for: survival, cleanliness, and health. The lessons of the past are still relevant today, as we continue to work toward a cleaner, healthier world for future generations. And so as you reflect on your journey through the medieval world, you understand that hygiene is not just about the absence of disease. It's about the creation of a society that values health, that invests in the well-being of its people, and that recognises the interconnectedness of cleanliness, public health, and social progress. The medieval world may have been filthy and disease-ridden, but it was also a world that paved the way for the modern world we live in today. In the end, the history of hygiene is a history of perseverance, of adaptation, and of growth. It is a testament to humanity's ability to overcome hardship and to learn from the past. The medieval world may have been a world of filth, disease, and discomfort, but it was also a world that taught us the value of cleanliness. And though we may never be able to fully appreciate what it was like to live in such unsanitary conditions, we can honour the lessons of the past by continuing to prioritise public health and hygiene in the present and the future. Sweet dreams.